You become aware of the morning slowly, not through any sudden noise, but through a change in the texture of the dark. The black behind closed eyelids softens from char to a deep grey blue, and the air that touches your cheek feels different to the air that was there in the deepest part of night. It carries now a faint promise of cold light pressing against the stable's eastern wall. Somewhere above the thatch, a blackbird makes its first short call, a sound that does not pierce the silence so much as settle into it, like a small stone dropped into still water, the ripples fading before they reach the shore. You lie under a rough woolen blanket on a straw pallet in the corner of the stable, the pallet raised just a hand's breadth from the flagstones by a wooden frame that creaks only if you shift too quickly, which you do not. You lie there for a while longer because there is no urgency, because the horses are still breathing in the slow rhythm of rest, and because the cold has not yet sharpened enough to make the blanket feel thin. The straw inside the pallet has compacted under you during the night, forming a shallow hollow that fits the curve of your shoulder and hip, and this hollow is slightly warm from your own body, a warmth you will have to leave soon, but not yet. When at last you open your eyes, you see the rafters first, the dark oak beams running across the ceiling like the ribs of an upturned ship, so familiar that you could trace each one from memory with a finger even in total darkness. Between the beams, the underside of the thatch is a dim tangle of reed and straw, here and there a feather caught from a sparrow, a wisp of old cobweb that trembles in a draught. You cannot feel at floor level. You push the blanket down by folding it back upon itself, a slow deliberate action because the blanket is heavy wool and your arms are still heavy with the last threads of sleep. The air outside the blanket is immediately cooler against your neck and wrists, and the coolness tells you that the night has been clear, that the mist has not yet risen from the river, and that the frost has not come because the flankstones do not have that particular bright sheen they get when the cold bites hard. You sit up, and the straw in the pallet rustles with a dry papery sound that seems loud inside the stable's hush, though it is not really loud. It is simply that every other sound is so small, a horse shifting its weight from one hind foot to the other, the soft flap of its lower lip as it exhales, the distant single toll of the priory bell that marks the hour of lauds drifting across the cloister and through the gap at the top of the stable door. You stand, and your bare feet meet the flagstones, which are cold, but not unkindly so, their surface worn smooth by the countless passages of grooms and monks and horses over the years. The stones are a pale grey, faintly green in the low light, each one a different size and shape fitted together with thin seams of mortar that have crumbled in places, leaving small crevices where dust and chaff accumulate. You reach for your tunic, a garment of brown wool that hangs over the wooden rail beside your pallet, its weave so familiar to your fingers that you do not need to think about the action of pulling it over your head and settling it across your shoulders. The tunic smells of hay and horses and a little of wood smoke, not the sharp tang of fresh smoke, but the deep mellow scent that soaks into cloth over weeks and months, a scent so constant that you no longer notice it unless you deliberately pause to breathe it in, which this morning you do not. You tie a length of hemp cord around your waist as a belt, the knot a simple loop that you have tied so many times your hands complete the motion entirely on their own, and then you step into your soft leather shoes, the leather worn to the shape of your feet, the soles thin enough that you can still feel the texture of the flagstones through them. The stable is a long rectangle of stone and wood, built against the outer wall of the priory's domestic range. It holds 6 stalls on one side and a broad aisle on the other, with a hayloft above reached by a ladder of peeled ash poles lashed together with hide strips. At this early hour, the light comes only from a single unshuttered window, high in the gable end, and from the gaps around the main door, a pair of heavy oak leaves that are pulled shut but not barred. The light that enters is grey and watery, the light of a November dawn that will never quite commit to brightness, and it falls in long sloping rectangles across the aisle, illuminating the dust suspended in the air like 1,000 tiny flecks of gold leaf that drift and turn without any wind to move them. You walk to the door and lift the wooden latch, a smooth bar of ash polished dark by the oil of many hands, and pull the left-hand leaf inward just enough to look out. The world beyond is a study in grey and muted green, the cobbles of the yard glistening with dew, the low wall of the kitchen garden the roofline of the infirmary beyond, and above all of it, a sky the colour of unwashed wool, unbroken by any seam of blue. A light mist hangs at the height of the rooftops, not thick enough to obscure them, but enough to soften every edge so that the buildings seem to float slightly above the ground. You take a long breath of the outside air, which tastes of wet stone and fallen leaves, and then you close the door again, leaving it open just a finger's width so that more of that pale light can find its way inside. The first task of the day is the straw. The stalls have deep beds of straw laid down to cushion the horses' feet and to absorb their night waste, and each morning the straw must be turned, the clean shaken free of the soiled, fresh straw added, the old removed in heaps to the midden behind the stable. You walk to the corner where the tools are kept and take up the pitchfork, a three-pronged fork of beech wood and iron with a shaft worn to a dark gleam where your hands grip it. The wood of the shaft is cool and a little damp from the night, and as you lift it, the iron tines give a faint ringing note when they tap against a bucket, a note that dies almost as soon as it is born. You begin in the stall nearest the door, the stall of the grey gelding who is standing with his hindquarters towards you and his head low, still not fully awake, his lower lip drooping, so that a small thread of hay-scented saliva hangs from it and sways gently as he breathes. You speak to him, not a word, just a low sound in your throat that is half hum and half murmur, a sound that means I am here, it is only me, the day is beginning. He does not lift his head, but one ear rotates lazily towards you, a small acknowledgement, and then returns to its forward-facing rest position. With the pitchfork, you begin to lift and shake the straw. The motion is an old rhythm, learned long ago and now as natural as breathing. You slide the tines under a clump of straw near the back of the stall, lift, shake gently, so that the clean golden strands separate and fall back while the darkened wet plumps cling to the tines, then carry the forkful to the barrow that stands in the aisle. The shaking of the straw makes a soft shushing sound, a sound that fills the stable and seems to push back against the silence without breaking it, the way a light rain falls on a pond without breaking the surface tension. The clean straw that falls back into the stall gleams in the growing light, its color shifting from gray to a warm yellow ochre, and the smell that rises from the disturbed bedding is a complex blend of dry grain husks, meadow flowers, long dried, the faint green sharpness of broken stalks, and beneath it all the warm animal scent of the horse himself, a smell that is not unpleasant but simply present, the foundational note upon which all the other smells are built. You work your way along the back wall of the stall, then along the side wall, the fork moving in its steady arc, and the barrow slowly fills with dark sodden straw and lumps of manure. When the barrow is half full, you set the pitchfork aside against the stall partition with its tines pointing up so that no one will trip over them, and you take up the birch broom that leans in the corner. The broom is a bundle of long birch twigs bound tightly around a hazel handle with strips of willow bark, the twigs worn at the tips to a soft brush that moves easily across the flagstones. You sweep the aisle where some straw has fallen during the forking, the bristles making a continuous whisper against the stone, a whisper that changes slightly in pitch when the broom crosses a joint in the flagstones. The dust rises in a small cloud and catches the light from the door, and for a moment you are surrounded by a golden haze of chaff and dust motes that dance in the thin winter sunbeam. You sweep the debris into a neat pile against the threshold, and later you will gather it with a smaller handbrush of stiff pig bristles and add it to the barrow, but for now the pile can wait. The horses do not mind a small pile of sweepings. They are patient, far more patient than any human could ever be in the face of such small repetitive work, and their patience seeps into you, settles in your bones, until you feel that you could sweep and fork and carry for 1,000 mornings and never grow weary of it. You return to the stall with an armload of fresh straw from the bale stored in the hayloft. This straw is brighter than the bedding straw, a clear pale gold, the stalk still straight and crisp, not yet broken by the weight of a horse's body. The bale is bound with a twisted rope of straw itself, and you break the rope with a sharp pull, the strands snapping with a dry crackle. The fresh straw has a different smell, cleaner, with a hint of sun caught inside it from the summer when it was cut, and as you spread it across the floor of the stall it rustles and settles with a sound like the pages of a very large book being turned very slowly. You spread it thickly in the corners, where the gelding likes to lie, thinner along the front edge, near the manger, where he stands to eat. The new straw overlays the old straw that you shook clean, the two layers meeting in a soft seam, and the stall now looks and smells like a newly made bed, a bed for a creature far larger and simpler than yourself. The gelding finally lifts his head properly, and turns his long grey face towards you, his dark eyes liquid and calm, his nostrils flaring slightly as he breathes in the scent of the fresh straw. You run your hand down the flat plane of his cheek, the short hair smooth and warm, and he leans into your touch with the faintest pressure, as gentle as a cat pushing its head against a hand. And then he turns back to his manger to see if any last wisps of hay remain from the night. You take the full barrow out to the midden, wheeling it carefully across the cobbled yard, the iron-rimmed wheel rumbling over the stones. The mist has begun to lift in earnest now, drawing back from the buildings like a slow curtain, revealing the tall windows of the chapter house and the grey bulk of the cathedral's eastern end, rising beyond the cloister wall. The air is still, but high up the weathercock on the infirmary roof gives a single creak, a rusty sound that speaks of damp and age. You tip the barrow's contents onto the midden heap, which steams faintly in the cold air, its own small climate of warmth and decay, and then you right the barrow and wheel it back to the stable, the empty barrow lighter and easier to manage, its handles bouncing slightly in your grip with every cobble. Back inside, the stable feels warmer than it did before, the heat of the horses' bodies and the insulating layer of fresh straw holding a pocket of mild air against the cold that presses at the walls. You next sweep the threshold itself, using the larger broom this time, working from the deep shadow inside the door out towards the light, the birch twigs gathering up the dried mud that flaked from your own shoes the night before, a few fallen leaves that blew in when the door was open, and the ever-present dust that settles on all surfaces in a stable no matter how often you sweep. The leaves are oak, brown and crisp, their edges curled like old parchment, and they crackle as they tumble into the pile. When the threshold is clean, you stand the broom in its corner and take a moment to simply stand still, your hands resting on the top of the stall partition, your weight shifted onto one leg, your breathing slow and deep. The stable at this hour is a place of profound quiet. Outside, the sounds of the priory are beginning, the distant chanting from the choir, a door opening and closing with a soft thud, the clang of a pot from the kitchen yard. But inside, the only sounds are the steady chewing of the bay mare who has woken and pulled a mouthful of hay from her net, the creak of a timber settling, and the tiny scratch of a sparrow investigating a crumb on the rafters. The light has strengthened just enough that you can see the greenish tinge of the moss that grows in the crevices of the stone walls, the way the cobwebs between the beams are beaded with condensation, each tiny drop a perfect sphere that holds a miniature reflection of the window. You notice these things not because they are remarkable, but because there is nothing else to notice, nothing that demands your attention, no urgent task, no voice calling, no sudden event. The world has narrowed to this rectangle of stone and straw and warm breathing bodies, and within this rectangle time moves differently, not in a line, but in a circle, the circle of the day that turns like the wheel of a cart, always the same, always new. You walk slowly down the aisle past each stall, looking at the occupants with a calm, unfocused attention. The grey gelding is now fully awake and is lipping at the edge of his water bucket, the water making small lapping sounds as his muzzle disturbs its surface. The bay mare is still chewing, her jaw moving in a slow sideways grind, her eyes half closed in contentment. The other stalls hold a young chestnut cob with a white star on his forehead, currently lying down with his legs tucked under him like a cat, and the two sturdy pack ponies who share the largest stall and stand with their heads together as if conferring on some matter of great importance, known only to ponies. You pause at each stall and offer a quiet word or a touch, nothing more than a greeting, a reassurance that all is well, and each horse acknowledge you in its own way. A twitch of an ear, a soft snort, a shifting of weight. These exchanges are so small and so familiar that they hardly register as actions, more as a continuous flow of mutual presence, like the way a tree and the grass beneath it exist together without needing to speak. The bell for prime sounds in the distance, a series of notes that rise and fall in a pattern so ingrained in you that you do not count them, but simply know them. the way you know the shape of your own hand. The sound reminds you that the morning is advancing, that soon the other stable hands will arrive, and the rhythm of the day will broaden to include voices and shared tasks, but for now, you are still alone with the horses and the straw and the soft grey light. You return to your corner by the door, and pick up the small hand brush to gather the pile of sweepings that has been waiting. You kneel on the flagstones, the cold seeping through the wool of your tunic at the knees, and you sweep the dust and chaff and leaf fragments into a shallow wooden scoop, then carry the scoop to the barrow and tip it in. The motion is so small and so complete that it requires no thought, and when it is done you cannot quite remember doing it, only that the threshold is now clean, and the broom is back in its corner, and the barrow is pushed against the wall out of the way. You stand in the doorway again, one shoulder leaning against the jamb, and look out at the yard. The mist has gone entirely now, dissolved into the grey-white sky that promises rain later, but not yet. A few crows are walking on the cobbles near the kitchen door, their heads bobbing as they search for anything that might have been dropped the night before. A lay brother crosses the yard with a basket of bread under his arm, his robe brushing the ground, his face turned down against the cold, and he does not see you standing in the stable doorway, because the interior is too dark and his mind is elsewhere, on the loaves and the ovens and the next task. You watch him go without any particular feeling, simply noting his passing the way you might note a cloud crossing the sun. And then he is gone, and the yard is empty again, except for the crows. The bell's echo fades, and the silence that follows is deeper than before. A true silence in which even the horses seem to be listening. You feel the day settle around you like a garment put on slowly, the morning now fully established, the first task completed. The straw is fresh and golden in the stalls, the aisle is swept, the threshold is clean, the air inside the stable is warm and sweet, with the scent of hay and the quiet contentment of animals. You pull the door leaf closed to its former position, leaving just the narrow gap for light, and you stand for a moment in the middle of the aisle, listening to the soft sound of the mist dripping from the thatched eaves outside. A sound that is not quite a rhythm, but a pattern of random drops falling onto the cobbles, each drop a tiny punctuation in the long quiet sentence of the day. The morning has settled now into its middle part, the part where the light no longer grows brighter, but simply holds steady, a flat, pale grey like the underside of a pewter plate. Outside the stable, the crows have wandered off towards the kitchen garden, and the lay brother with the basket of bread is long gone beyond the cloister arch. The bell for prime has faded to a silence so complete you can hear the tiny scratching of the sparrows in the thatch overhead, a sound like the nib of a quill moving across parchment. You stand in the aisle for a moment with your hands resting lightly on your belt, the hemp cord rough under your thumbs, and you let your gaze travel across the shapes of the horses in their stalls. The grey gelding has finished lipping at his water bucket and now stands with his head turned towards the middle of the stable, his ears soft and forward, his eyes following you with a mild curiosity that is not expectation but simple awareness of your presence. It is his coat that draws your attention, the way the new daylight touches its surface and reveals a fine powder of stable dust that has settled overnight along the ridge of his back, dulling the dappled grey to a uniform pale ash. You decide that now is the right time for the grooming, before the other hands arrive and their movements fill the space with a different kind of quiet, a busy quiet, full of small collisions of sound, and so you walk to the wooden peg on the wall where the currycomb hangs by its leather loop. The currycomb is an object of simple design, a flat oval of beechwood shape to fit the palm, with 3 rows of short iron teeth set into the underside. The wood has darkened over years of use to the colour of strong tea, and its surface is polished by the oils of your own skin and the skins of those who used it before you, a gleam that runs along the edges where the grip is firmest. You take it down and feel the familiar weight settle in your hand, not heavy, but solid. The slight coolness of the metal teeth against your fingers as you turn it over. The leather loop is stretched and soft, and it hangs loose as you carry the comb across the aisle to the grey gelding's stall. You unlatch the stall door, the wooden bar lifting with a soft plunk, and you step inside while the gelding watches you with his head just barely turned. The straw crunches under your shoes, the fresh golden straw that you laid down not an hour earlier, and the smell of it rises again as your feet disturb its surface. You ease the stall door closed behind you, so that the gelding knows he is not going anywhere and neither are you. You are simply two creatures sharing a small space for a time. You begin by laying your free hand flat on the horse's neck, just ahead of the shoulder, where the grey coat is short and smooth and warm from the blood moving beneath. The gelding exhales a long breath through his nostrils, a breath that stirs the fine hairs on the back of your wrist, and he shifts his weight slightly so that his near hind hoof comes to rest on its toe. The equine equivalent of a man settling into a comfortable stance. You let your hand rest there for a count of 5, not counting, but simply waiting until you feel a particular quality of stillness pass from him into you, and then you bring the currycomb up to meet the coat. The first stroke is a circle, a slow clockwise circle just behind his ear, and the iron teeth engage with the hair in a way that produces a faint scratching sound, a sound that is both rough and soft, like a dry brush moving over coarse linen. The teeth pass through the outer layer of the coat and reach the denser undercoat where the dust and the loose hair have gathered, and as you complete the circle and begin another, a fine grey-brown haze lifts from the surface. A haze so light that it is barely visible until it catches the beam of light from the high window and turns for a moment into a column of tiny floating particles, each one spinning in its own small current of air. You work in a steady rhythm, the comb describing overlapping circles that travel slowly along the curve of the neck. The motion comes from your shoulder and your elbow, your wrist held firm so that the pressure remains constant, and the gelding responds to this pressure by lowering his head a fraction of an inch and allowing his lower lip to droop, the sign of an animal entirely at ease. The muscles of his neck are firm and long, and you can feel their shape through the comb, the way the brachiocephalic muscle runs from behind his ear down towards his chest, a subtle ridge that your hand follows like a potter's hand follows the contour of a vessel on the wheel. The dust that rises from the coat has a particular scent, not unpleasant, but deeply familiar, a blend of dried sweat that has worked its way to the surface of the hair over the night, of the straw he slept in, of the hay he ate, and of the faint, almost metallic smell of the iron teeth themselves as they warm from the friction. Each circle of the comb brings more of this scent into the air, and the stall gradually fills with it until it is the only thing you can smell, a smell that means horse and morning and work. Every minute or so you pause, not because you are tired, but because the teeth of the comb have filled with the soft grey undercoat and the fine particles of dust. You turn the comb over in your hand and tap it gently against the heel of your leather shoe, 2 or 3 sharp taps that produce a little puff of debris, the loose hair fluttering down to the straw in a small cloud that settles immediately. The tapping sound is a brief punctuation in the longer sentence of the grooming, and after you tap you inspect the comb quickly, your thumbnail scraping out any stubborn clump that has lodged between the teeth, and then you return the comb to the horse's neck and resume the circling. The gelding does not react to the tapping. He has heard it 1,000 times, and it means nothing to him except a momentary pause in the pleasant sensation of the comb. You work from the pole, the bony top of his head between his ears, down the left side of his neck, and the coat begins to change as you go. Where the comb has passed, the true color of the horse emerges, not the flat ash gray of the dusted surface, but a deeper, richer gray with a pattern of dapples that spread across his neck like the shadows of clouds moving over a still sea. The dapples are circles of darker gray, some as large as your palm, some no bigger than a penny, and they shift slightly as the muscles beneath them move, so that the pattern appears to be alive, a map of the horse's inner geography written on his skin. When you have finished the left side of the neck, you move around to the right side, stepping carefully over the straw so that you do not startle him. You place your hand on his shoulder to let him know where you are, and he cocks one ear back towards you, then forward again, a small gesture of acknowledgement. You begin again with the comb just behind his right ear, and the same slow circle begins, the same scratching sound, the same gentle haze of dust. The light from the window falls across this side of the neck at a slightly different angle, and the dapples appear darker here, more pronounced, as if the horse were made of 2 different greys, the left and the right. You note this without thinking, the way a sailor notes the color of the water, and you continue the motion until the entire neck, from poll to withers, has been worked over, the coat now uniform in its rich dappled gray and free of any trace of dust. You pause again, Tap the comb clean against your heel and walk to the front of the horse, facing him directly. He lowers his head and blows a soft puff of air through his nostrils into your chest, a greeting or a question, and you run the back of your hand down the long, flat plane of his face, feeling the hard bone beneath the velvet skin. The comb is for the larger surfaces of the body, not for the face, and so you hang it by its loop on the hook fixed to the stall partition, a hook of bent iron that has been there since the stable was built. You then reach for the soft brush, a flat brush made of horsehair set in a wooden block, and you use this to whisk away the loosened dust and hair from the gelding's face, the brush moving in short, smooth strokes down his cheek and over his jaw. The horsehair bristles are the same color as his coat, a soft silvery gray, and they leave a faint gleam on the short hairs, a gleam that catches the window light and turns his cheek into a polished stone. He closes his eyes slowly, the long pale lashes brushing his cheek, and you feel the tremor of a deep satisfaction run through him, a shiver that starts at his shoulders and ends in a gentle stamp of his hind foot. You take the currycomb down from its hook and move to the horse's left shoulder. The shoulder is a broad slope of muscle that rises and falls with his breathing, and the comb circles here must be larger and slower to cover the area. You rest your free hand on his withers, the highest point of the shoulder, and you feel the slight give of the skin over the bone, the warmth that has intensified from the friction of the grooming. The sound of the comb changes on the shoulder, becoming a deeper, more muted scratch because the muscle here is thicker and the coat is slightly coarser. The dust that rises is heavier too, carrying more of the fine chaff from the straw bedding, and you pause more often to tap the comb clean, the rhythm of work, and pause settling into a pattern as steady as a loom shuttle. The gelding leans his weight into the pressure of the comb just a little, asking for more, and you oblige by pressing more firmly, the teeth digging down to the skin and encouraging the natural oils to rise and coat each hair shaft, giving the coat a quiet luster that glows in the grey light. You work your way down the left foreleg, using the comb on the upper part where the muscle is full, and then you switch to a smaller currycomb, a round one with finer teeth that fits into the hollow of your palm, to do the lower leg where the bone is close to the surface and the hair is short and fine. The gelding lifts his foot without being asked when you touch the tendon at the back, a movement so automatic that it is like a man offering his hand for a handshake, and he holds his hoof up while you work the comb gently over the cannon bone and the fetlock, the fine hairs here giving way to the harder surface of the hoof itself. The hoof needs no comb, it will be cleaned later with the pick, and so after a moment you set the hoof back down, the horn making a soft clop on the straw, and you straighten up with a hand on your lower back, feeling the stretch in your spine. The gelding's flank is the next long plane of coat to cover, stretching from the back of the ribs to the hip. When you move to the flank, he turns his head to watch you, a slight tension entering his neck because the flanks are a more sensitive area, and many horses are ticklish there. You speak to him in the low, humming murmur that is your voice for the stable. Not a word, just a flow of sound that means nothing and means everything, and after a moment his head returns to its resting position and the tension leaves his neck. You begin the comb circles at the top of the flank, just below the spine, and you work downwards in overlapping rows, the way you would if you were painting a wall with a brush, each stroke blending into the next. The hair here is shorter than on the shoulder and has a silvery sheen that becomes more pronounced as the comb lifts the dust and the oils. The gelding's skin twitches once, a brief flicker under the comb, and then it is still, and you continue without pause, your circles reaching down to the line of his belly where the coat is the color of a winter sky just before snow, a soft, silvery white. You tap the comb clean for the final time on the left side and step back, breathing deeply. The air in the stall now thick with the clean smell of horse and the faint dry scent of the disturbed dust. You pick up the body brush, a larger brush with longer bristles of soft horsehair, and you use it to sweep over all the areas you have carried, removing any last particles of dust that remain on the surface. The body brush makes a different sound, a gentle whisking that is almost without friction, and it leaves the coat with a uniform smoothness that is cool and slightly slippery under your palm. The gelding's dapples are now vivid, each one a distinct dark island in the sea of lighter grey, and the light from the window seems to slide over them like water. You run your bare hand from his shoulder to his hip, feeling the warmth and the sleekness, a sensation that is deeply satisfying in a way that needs no explanation. The horse stamps again softly and releases a long sigh that flutters his nostrils and makes the straw at his feet stir. And you know that on his right side the coat is still dusty, still dull, still waiting for the comb, and so you switch sides and begin the entire process again. From the pole down to the flank, the comb circles, mapping the geography of his body as the morning continues its slow drift towards noon. The grey gelding stands now with both sides of his coat gleaming in the muted light, the dapples on his haunches as clear as stones in a stream bed, and the currycomb hangs once more from its leather loop on the iron hook, the metal teeth still carrying a faint warmth from the friction of the work. You run your palm one last time down the slope of his shoulder, feeling the smoothness that your labour has produced, a texture like heavy silk stretched over warm stone, and then you unlatch the stall door and step out into the aisle. The air in the aisle feels cooler than the air inside the stall, cooler and thinner, and touched with a faint drift of outdoor dampness that seeps through the gap in the main door, and this coolness reminds you of the next thing that needs doing, because the water buckets in the stalls are low. The grey gelding's bucket has a dark ring around its inside at the level where the water has sat overnight, a ring that marks the subtraction of what he drank during the dark hours, and the bay mare's bucket is even lower, the water barely covering the bottom, its surface slightly cloudy with the dust of hay that has fallen from her muzzle. The horses need fresh water, cold and clear, and the only source of that water is the well in the outer courtyard, a walk of perhaps 60 paces from the stable door across the cobblestones that you know as intimately as you know the lines on your own palms. You take up the wooden yoke that leans against the wall near the door, a yoke of pale ashwood worn dark at the centre where it rests across the back of the neck, with 2 short chains hanging from iron rings at either end, each chain ending in a hook. The yoke is not heavy, but it is awkwardly long, and you have learned over the years to carry it tilted slightly so that it does not knock against the doorframe as you pass through. You lift it now with one hand, the wood cool and smooth, and you duck your head to settle it across your shoulders, the familiar weight pressing into the wool of your tunic. The chains jingle softly, a thin metallic sound that is one of the stable's characteristic noises, a sound that belongs to this particular moment of the day, just as the scratching of the currycomb belongs to the earlier hour. With the yoke in place, you take down the 2 wooden pails from their pegs, pails made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, their insides dark with the constant wetting and drying of years, and you fit the bail of each pail over the hook at the end of its chain. The pails swing slightly as you move, empty and light, their bottoms tapping against your thighs with a dull thud at each step. You push open the stable door, the left leaf swinging outward on its iron hinges with a groan that is low and long, the sound of iron rubbing against iron in the damp air. The light outside has not changed. Still that flat grey-white sky, still the soft diffusion of light that makes everything seem slightly closer than it really is, as if the world has been wrapped in a layer of thin wool. The cobblestones of the yard are dark with moisture, not wet exactly, but damp, the kind of damp that comes from a night of mist and does not dry even when the day has been up for several hours. You step out onto the stones, and your soft leather shoes find their grip immediately, the soles moulding to the rounded tops of the cobbles. You begin the walk to the well, a walk you have made so many times that your feet know the way entirely on their own, leaving your mind free to notice the small things that are different today from yesterday. The cobblestone path runs from the stable door across the outer yard in a broad curve that skirts the edge of the kitchen garden wall. The stones themselves are river stones, rounded and smooth, brought here long ago from the bed of the Stour, and set into the earth in a pattern that is not quite a pattern, a loose arrangement of greys and browns and the occasional yellowish stone that stands out like a pale thumb. Between the stones, the earth is packed hard from centuries of footfalls, but in the crevices there is moss, a dark green moss that grows in tiny cushions no larger than a fingernail, and this moss is at its thickest now in late autumn, when the sun is too weak to dry it out. As you walk, you notice the way the moss gives slightly under your weight, a softness that is almost imperceptible, and the way it releases a faint green smell, the smell of wet stone and living things too small to see. The pails swing gently on their chains, their motion a steady pendulum, that matches the rhythm of your walking, and the chains make their small jingling music with each stride. You pass the corner of the kitchen garden wall, a low wall of flint and mortar over which the bare branches of an apple tree reach like the arms of someone stretching in the morning. A few fallen apples lie on the cobbles, small and withered, their skins brown and wrinkled, and you steer around them without thinking because you know they are there, because they have been there for a week now, and no one has swept them up. Beyond the wall, the kitchen yard opens, and you can hear the sounds of the morning's cooking, the distant clatter of a pot, the voice of a lay brother calling something that is muffled by the walls, the hiss of water thrown onto hot stones. These sounds reach you as if from a great distance, even though they are close, because the air is thick and the mist has not entirely lifted from the lower parts of the yard, and sound travels strangely in such air, bending and softening, until it is more like the memory of sound than sound itself. You do not pause to listen. You simply register these noises as you might register the calls of birds, a part of the background texture of the world. The well stands in the center of the outer courtyard, a circular structure of grey stone with a low wall around its mouth and a wooden roof supported by 4 posts. The roof shaped like a pointed hat and covered with wooden shingles that have turned silver with age. A windlass spans the opening, a horizontal drum of oak wound with a thick rope that descends into the darkness below, and at the end of the rope hangs the great iron-bound bucket that is used by all who need water in this part of the priory. You stop beside the well and ease the yoke from your shoulders, setting it down on the cobbles with care, so that the pails do not tip over. The well wall is cold under your hands as you lean against it, the stone rough with the marks of the mason's chisel and the softer weathering of rain and wind. You look down into the shaft and see nothing but a darkness that fades into a deeper darkness, a column of still air that smells of cold stone and minerals, and the faint living scent of the water far below. You take hold of the windlass handle, a bar of iron worn bright where many hands have gripped it, and you begin to turn it so that the rope pays out. The windlass creaks as it turns, a rhythmic sound that rises on each half rotation and falls on the next. Creak and pause, a slow metronome that measures the descent of the bucket. The rope passes through your fingers as it unspools, the hemp fibers rough and slightly greasy, and you feel the weight of the bucket pulling steadily downwards, a weight that lessens when the bucket meets the surface of the water. You hear the meeting before you feel it, a soft splash that echoes up the stone shaft, like a voice speaking a single syllable in a very large, empty room. The splash dies away and you let the bucket sink, the rope going slack in your hand, and you count slowly to 10 to give it time to fill completely, the numbers passing through your mind without urgency, one after another, like the drops of water that are even now trickling into the bucket at the bottom of the shaft. When the count is done, you reverse your grip and begin to turn the windlass the other way, hauling the full bucket up from the dark. This is the harder part of the work, and you settle into it with the same patient rhythm you use for currying a horse, a steady pull that comes from your shoulders and your back, the muscles warming slowly to the task. The windlass creaks again, a different creak now, deeper and more strained, and the rope winds onto the drum in tight, even coils, each coil overlapping the last. The bucket rises foot by foot, and you can hear the water inside it sloshing gently, a sound that grows louder as it nears the surface. When the bucket appears at the top of the shaft, you stop turning and reach out to grasp its bail, the iron cold and wet under your fingers, and you swing it over to the well wall, setting it on the broad stone coping with a heavy thud. The water inside is dark and perfectly still, the surface a circle of black glass that reflects the underside of the shingled roof above, and as you watch, a single drop of condensation falls from the roof and lands in the bucket with a tiny plink, sending a ring expanding outward to the iron sides. You lift one of your pails from the yoke and dip it into the well bucket, the water flowing in over the rim with a gurgling sound that is full of small echoes. The water is very cold, cold enough to make your fingers ache as they grip the bail, and it has a smell that is almost no smell at all, just a faint mineral freshness that speaks of the deep chalk beds through which it has filtered. You fill the first pail to within a finger's breadth at the top, then the second, and then you pour what remains in the well bucket back into the shaft, where it falls for a long time in a scattered sound, like a handful of pebbles dropped into a cave. The bucket swings back into place and the rope grows still, and you turn the windlass one more half-turn to set it at its proper height for the next person who will come for water. You settle the yoke back across your shoulders, the wood now feeling slightly colder than before, and you bend your knees a little to take the weight as you hook the full pails onto the chains. The pails are heavy now, the water inside them pulling downwards with a steady, insistent gravity, and as you straighten up and begin the walk back to the stable, the yoke presses more firmly into your shoulders, a pressure that is not painful but simply present, a reminder of the work. You walk more slowly now, not because you are tired, but because the water requires a measured pace, a deliberate step that will not set the pails swinging too wildly and slopping their contents over the rims. The cobblestones feel different under your feet on the return journey, more uneven, more demanding of your attention, and you place each step carefully on the flattest parts of the stones, your eyes on the ground just ahead of your toes. The moss in the crevices gleams with a brighter green now that the mist has lifted a little more, and you notice a single feather caught in one of the moss cushions, a small grey feather from a pigeon, its barbs beaded with tiny drops of moisture. You pass the kitchen garden wall again and see the same withered apples, the same bare branches of the apple tree, the same dark earth of the garden bed beyond, and you feel a quiet continuity in these repeated sights, the sense that the world is holding steady while you move through it. The pails swing in small arcs, and a few drops of water escape over the rim of the left-hand pail, landing on the cobbles in dark spots that fade almost immediately into the general dampness. The chains jingle, the yoke creaks faintly with each step, and your breathing settles into a slow rhythm that matches the rhythm of your feet, a rhythm so steady that you could almost fall asleep standing up, walking this path that you have walked 1,000 times before. You reach the stable door and turn sideways carefully so that the yoke and the pails clear the frame, stepping through the gap into the dim interior that smells of hay and horses and the lingering ghost of the currycomb's dust. The change in light makes you pause for a moment, your eyes adjusting from the grey brightness of the yard to the softer dusk of the aisle. And in that pause, you hear the bay mare shift in her stall and blow a soft breath through her nostrils, as if she knows what you are carrying and is already anticipating the taste of the fresh water. You walk to the grey gelding stall first, balancing the yoke while you unlatch the door with one hand, the other hand steadying the swinging pail. The gelding has been dozing in your absence, his lower lip drooping and his ears at half-mast, but he wakes fully when he hears the water sloshing and raises his head with a slow, deliberate motion, his nostrils flaring wide. You unhook the right-hand pail from its chain and carry it with two hands to the corner of the stall where the water bucket sits, a larger bucket of the same oak and iron construction as the pails. The old water that remains in the bottom is cloudy and warm, and you lift the bucket and carry it out of the stall, tipping its contents onto the cobbles just outside the door, where it spreads in a dark fan before running into the cracks between the stones. You return to the stall and pour the fresh water into the bucket, the stream catching the light from the high window and turning to a ribbon of pale silver as it falls, and the sound it makes is a deep, musical note that changes in pitch as the bucket fills, rising from a low gurgle to a brighter splash. The gelding watches this with his head over your shoulder, his breath warm on the back of your neck, and as soon as you step aside he lowers his muzzle into the bucket and begins to drink, the water lapping and slurping, the long muscles of his throat working in steady swallows that you can see moving under the grey skin of his neck. You repeat the process for the bay mare, unhooking the second pail and carrying it to her stall, emptying her old water in the same way, pouring the fresh water in the same silver stream, and she drinks with the same deep swallows, her eyes half closed in contentment. The chestnut cob in the next stall is still lying down, but he will drink when he rises, and the pack ponies have water still from the night before, enough to last them until the next trip. You stand for a moment in the aisle with the empty pails swinging lightly from the yoke, watching the horses drink, listening to the gentle percussion of their swallowing and the occasional snort as they clear their nostrils, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a simple task completed, a need met, a small part of the world put in order. The water you carried is now inside the horses, becoming part of them, and the well is still there in the courtyard, full and dark and waiting for the next time, and the cobblestone path between the stable and the well is still damp with the memory of the mist, and nothing has changed, and everything is as it should be. The horses have drunk their fill now, and the sound of their swallowing has faded into the soft background of the stable, replaced by the occasional contented sigh and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The grey gelding stands with his muzzle still damp from the bucket, a few drops of water clinging to the long hairs of his chin and catching the light like tiny glass beads, and the bay mare has turned her attention back to her hay net, pulling out strands one by one with a delicacy that belies the strength of her jaw. You lift the yoke from your shoulders and hang it back on its iron hook beside the door, the wood still carrying the faint chill of the outside air, and you set the empty pails on the flagstones beneath their pegs for the next time they are needed. The morning continues its slow, imperceptible movement towards noon, and there is time now for a task that requires no walking and no hauling, a task that can be done in one place with the door half open to the yard and the light falling across your hands. You turn your attention to the leathers. They hang along the wall opposite the stalls, a row of bridles and reins and a single saddle, each suspended from its own wooden peg, driven into the mortar between the stones. The pegs are of turned ash, smooth and slightly tapered, warm to a dark polish where the leather rests against them. There are 6 pegs in all. There are only 4 hold tack today. The bridle of the grey gelding with its simple snaffle bit, the bridle of the bay mare distinguished by a small brass rosette at the cheek-piece, a spare headstall of darker leather that awaits repair, and the saddle that belongs to no single horse but is used when a brother needs to ride to the outlying manors. The other 2 pegs are empty, their shadows falling in diagonal lines across the stone wall, and on one of them hangs the thick woolen hood you wear when the weather turns truly bitter, a hood that has not yet been needed this autumn, but soon will be. You lift the grey gelding's bridle from its peg, cradling the leather in both hands. The leather is brown, a deep brown that is almost black in the recesses where the straps join, and it is cool and slightly stiff from the night. The reins are stitched to the bit rings with heavy waxed thread. The stitch is still firm and even after many months of use, and the bit itself is a simple bar of iron with a gentle curve, polished bright at the points where it rests against the horse's lips and darker where it passes through the rings. You turn the bridle over in your hands, examining each strap by habit, your fingers running along the edges to feel for any crack or weakness. The leather is sound, supple where it needs to be, firm where it must hold, and it smells of horse and oil and the faint tang of the iron bit. You hang the bridle over your arm and walk to the far corner of the stable where a low wooden bench sits against the wall, a bench of rough oak planks that has served this purpose for longer than anyone can remember. Beside the bench, on a small shelf carved into the wall, sits a clay pot of neat's foot oil, a bundle of clean rags, and a small pot of wood ash mixed with a little tallow for the brass. You sit on the bench, the wood creaking once under your weight and then falling silent, and you arrange the bridle across your lap with the reins draped over your knee so that they do not trail on the flagstones. The light from the doorway falls across your left shoulder and illuminates your hands and the leather with a steady, muted glow, a light that is perfect for close work, bright enough to see every detail but not so bright that it strains the eyes. You open the clay pot of neat's foot oil, the lid lifting with a soft friction of baked clay against baked clay, and the smell of the oil rises to meet you. It is a smell that is difficult to describe, rich and warm and faintly fatty, the smell of rendered hooves and bones transformed by time into something that is not food but preservation, a smell that means care and maintenance and the quiet continuation of things. You dip the tip of a rag into the oil, just enough to darken the cloth with a small coin of moisture, and you begin to work the oil into the leather of the headstall. The motion is a gentle one, a slow rubbing that is entirely different from the vigorous circling of the currycomb. The rag moves in long, smooth strokes along the grain of the leather, spreading the oil into a thin film that sinks almost immediately into the surface, darkening the brown to a richer, deeper shade. The leather drinks the oil as if it were thirsty, and as it drinks it becomes softer under your fingers, more pliable, the fibers relaxing after the long, dry night. You work from the crown piece down, the strap that passes behind the horse's ears, and your fingers follow the curve of the leather around the brow band, a shorter strap that is shaped like a gentle arch. The brow band carries a faint imprint of the gelding's head, a slight stretch at the center where it presses against the bony prominence of his forehead, and as you oil this area, you can almost feel the shape of the horse in the leather, a ghost of his presence embedded in the fibers. You turn the bridle over and oil the underside of the crown piece, where the leather lies against the horse's poll, and this area is slightly rougher, the grain standing up in tiny ridges that smooth out under the oil and the pressure of the rag. The cheek pieces come next, the long straps that run down either side of the horse's face and connect to the bit. You take the left cheek piece in your hand and run the oiled rag down its length, from the buckle at the top to the bit ring at the bottom, and the leather changes color as you go, the dark oiled trail following your hand like a shadow. The buckle is of iron, plain and sturdy, and you check that the tongue moves freely in its hole, that the leather around the buckle holes is not stretched or torn. It is not. The leather is still firm, the holes still round and crisp, and you move on to the right cheek piece and repeat the same slow journey with the rag. The reins are the longest part of the work, 2 strips of leather each as long as your arm, and you oil them inch by inch, the rag travelling from the bit end to the hand end, your fingers tracing every stitch of the waxed thread that binds the leather to the iron rings. The reins have absorbed the most oil over time because they are handled the most, and their surface is already smooth and dark and supple, like leather that has been dipped in water and then dried slowly in the shade. But still they take the oil, still they darken a little more, still they grow a little softer under your touch. When the oiling of the bridle is complete, you set it aside on the bench beside you, the leather gleaming softly in the grey light, and you wipe your fingers on a clean corner of the rag. The oil has left a faint sheen on your skin, and you rub your fingertips together, feeling the slight slippiness that will fade as the oil absorbs or is wiped away. You pick up the bridle again and turn your attention to the iron bit. The bit has its own small pot of cleaning paste, the wood ash and tallow mixture that you keep on the shelf. You take a pinch of the grey paste on the tip of your finger and rub it onto the bit, the grit of the ash mixing with the fat of the tallow to form a gentle abrasive. The rag is used again, a different rag this time, one that is stained dark with previous polishings, and you work the paste over the surface of the iron in small circles, much like the circles of the currycomb, but finer, tighter. The iron responds immediately, the dull grey film of oxidation lifting away to reveal the bright silver metal beneath. The bit grows shinier with each pass of the rag, and the smell of the tallow rises into the air, a faint animal scent that mingles with the neatsfoot oil and the ever-present hay. When the bit is polished to your satisfaction, you hang the bridle over your arm again and stand, the bench creaking as your weight lifts from it. You walk to the pegs and hang the bridle back in its place, the leather now supple and nourished, the bit catching the light with a small glint that is not quite a flash but a quiet gleam, the kind of gleam that speaks of care and attention. The empty peg beside it waits, and you turn to the bay mare's bridle next, lifting it down with the same two-handed care. This bridle is similar to the first, but it carries the small brass rosette at the cheek piece, a simple flower shape stamped from a thin sheet of brass and pinned through the leather. The rosette has grown dull with exposure to the stable air, its surface clouded with a greenish-brown tarnish that softens the edges of the petals. You carry the bridle to the bench and sit again, and this time you reach for the small clay pot of wood ash without the tallow, a drier mixture that is better suited to brass than to iron. The procedure with the brass rosette is delicate work, and you bend your head closer to your hands, the light from the doorway falling directly on the small metal flower. You take a pinch of the dry ash on the tip of your rag and rub it gently over the surface of the brass, the ash filling the crevices of the petals and lifting the tarnish away. The rosette begins to glow with a warm golden color, a color that seems to hold light even in the dim stable, and as you polish, you can see the reflection of your own face in the tiny curved surface, a miniature portrait distorted by the shape of the brass. The petals emerge from the tarnish one by one, each one a little brighter than before, and the center of the flower where the pen passes through is a dark dot that gradually lightens to a deep coppery hue. You work around the pin carefully, the rag twisted to a point, and when the rosette is as bright as you can make it, you set down the ash pot and wipe the brass clean with a dry corner of the rag. The rosette now gleams with a quiet warmth, like a small ember caught in the leather, and you turn your attention to the rest of the bridle, oiling the straps and polishing the bit in the same slow rhythm as before. The spare headstall is next, the one that awaits repair. It hangs on its peg with a broken cheek piece, the leather having parted just below the buckle where a previous stitching gave way. You take it down and examine it again, as you have examined it several times before, turning the broken end over in your hands. The leather is still good, not rotted or thin, and the break is a clean one that can be mended with a new length of waxed thread and a sharp awl. But the mending is a task for another time, a task that requires the awl and the thread, and a small block of beeswax that sits in the wooden chest under the bench, and you are not ready to begin that task today. Instead, you oil the sound parts of the headstall, the crown piece and the brow band, and the remaining cheek piece, keeping the leather supple while it waits for its repair, and then you hang it back on its peg with the broken end curled gently around the strap so that it does not trail. The saddle is the final piece. It sits on a low wooden rack beneath the pegs, not hung because it is too heavy for a single peg, and you lift it with both hands by the pommel and the cantle, the high front and the high back that curve upward like the ends of a smile. The saddle is heavier than the bridles, heavier than the water pails even, and you carry it to the bench and set it down with care, the wooden tree inside the leather creaking slightly as it settles. The saddle leather is darker than the bridle leather, a deep brown that is almost the color of roasted chestnuts, and it is tooled with a simple pattern of interlaced lines along the skirt, a pattern that has been worn smooth by the legs of many riders. The seat is slightly shiny from use, polished by the friction of woolen robes, and the underside is padded with fleece that has been compressed to a dense mat of off-white wool. You take up your oil rag again and begin with the pommel, working the oil into the leather around the high curved front where the rider's hand would rest. The pommel leather is thick and firm, and it takes the oil more slowly than the bridle straps, requiring you to work the rag in small circles and press the oil into the grain. The smell of neat's foot oil fills the corner of the stable now, layering over the hay and the horses and the dust until it becomes the dominant note, a smell that says that things are being cared for, that nothing is being neglected, that the small maintenance of the world is proceeding as it should. You work your way across the seat, the oil darkening the already dark leather to a deep lustrous brown that reflects the light in a soft blur, and then you move to the skirts, the broad flaps that hang down on either side and protect the horses' sides from the stirrup leathers. The skirts are stitched around their edges with 2 rows of waxed thread, the stitches still holding firm, and you trace each row with the oiled rag, feeding the leather between the stitches to keep it from cracking. The stirrup leathers themselves are separate straps that hang from iron bars under the skirts, and you unhook them one at a time and oil them as you oiled the reins, long slow strokes that travel from buckle to stirrup. The stirrups are of iron, shaped like broad Ds, and they are polished with the same ash paste as the bits, their flat bottoms worn thin by the soles of riding boots. When the saddle is fully oiled, you lift it again, your arms feeling the slight strain of the weight after the long session of close work, and you carry it back to its rack beneath the pegs. You settle it into place with the pommel facing the wall and the skirts spread evenly, and you step back to look at the row of leathers hanging above it, the 3 bridles and the empty pegs, and the woolen hood, all of them arranged in their quiet order. The brass rosette on the bay mare's bridle catches the light with its new warm gleam, and the bits of the grey gelding's bridle sends a small glint across the aisle, and the saddle sits solid and dark and ready for the next time someone needs to ride. You wipe your hands on the rag one final time and set the rag on the shelf beside the oil and the ash, and you roll your shoulders to ease the slight stiffness that has settled there from the bench, a stiffness that is not pain but simply the body's way of reminding you that you have been still for a while. Outside the stable, the light has begun its slow pivot towards afternoon, though the sky is still a uniform grey-white that gives no hint of the sun's position. A light breeze has come up, the first movement of air since the morning, and it stirs the fallen leaves in the yard and makes the stable door creak softly on its hinges. You walk to the door and stand in the opening, one hand resting on the frame, and you feel the breeze against your face, cool and damp, and carrying the distant smell of the river. The crows have returned to the kitchen yard, their black shapes moving against the grey cobbles, and a figure in a dark robe crosses the far end of the yard with a bundle of kindling under one arm. You watch these small movements of the outside world without any need to join them, and after a moment you turn back into the stable and pull the door leaf half closed, leaving just enough gap for the air to pass through. The horses are resting now, all of them, the gelding with one hind hoof cocked and his eyes half soot, the mare with her head low and her weight shifted onto 3 legs, the cob still lying in his straw with his white star shining like a small patch of snow, the ponies standing hip to hip and dozing in their shared stall. The stable is quiet again, the deep quiet that settles between tasks, a quiet that is made of many small sounds woven together so tightly that they become a single fabric of stillness. You stand in the aisle with your hands resting on your belt, and you feel the calm of the oil and the leather and the polished brass flowing into you. A calm that comes from the knowledge that everything is in order, that the tack is ready, that the horses are content, and that the afternoon will unfold in its own slow time, bringing its own small tasks, its own quiet rhythms, its own small tasks, its own quiet rhythms, its own small tasks, its own quiet rhythms. The second morning arrives, not as a slow brightening, but as a thickening of the air itself, a whiteness that presses against the stable walls and seeps through every chink and gap until the boundary between inside and outside becomes uncertain. You wake because the bay mare shifts in her stall, a heavy soft movement of hooves in straw that is followed by a low exhalation, almost a groan, the sound of a large animal stretching muscles that have been still for too long. The sound reaches you through the dark and pulls you gently up from sleep, and when you open your eyes, you cannot see the rafters. The darkness above you is not the darkness of night, but the darkness of a cloud that has settled on the ground, a fog so dense that the high window might as well be a wall of stone. You lie still under your blanket, listening, and the silence is different from yesterday's silence. Yesterday the quiet was crisp and edged, a quiet that let the distant bells through. Today, the quiet is muffled and thick, as if the whole stable has been wrapped in wool batting, and the only sound that reaches you clearly is the steady drip of condensed mist falling from the thatch onto the cobbles outside, a sound that has no rhythm but is continuous, like a conversation of water drops that never quite resolves into a pattern. You rise slowly, the cold touching your face and hands with a dampness that is new, a moisture that clings rather than bites. The blanket folds back with a heavier weight, because the wool has absorbed some of the mist during the night, and when you touch your tunic on its peg, the cloth feels cool and slightly limp, as if it has been hung near a stream. You dress in the dimness, your fingers finding the familiar shapes of cord and leather by touch, and you do not bother to open the main door because you know that opening it will reveal nothing but a wall of grey-white, a blankness where the yard should be. Instead you walk to the stalls by the faint glow that comes from the oil lamp you left burning low on its shelf, a single flame shaped like a teardrop that pushes back the fog just enough to show you the edges of things. The corner of the grey gelding stall, the dark curve of the bay mare's shoulder, the paler shape of the chestnut cob still curled in his straw. The bay mare is standing with her head turned towards the aisle, her ears pricked forward at something you cannot hear, and her dark eyes catch the lamp flame in 2 small reflections that glow like copper coins at the bottom of a well. You pause beside her stall and let your hand rest on the top rail of the partition, and she shifts her weight again and blows a soft breath through her nostrils, a breath that hangs in the cold air for a moment before dissolving into the general mist. Her colour is different from the gelding's cool grey, a deep rich brown that in full light would be the shade of polished chestnut, but here in the fog-dimmed stable is more like the colour of dark earth after rain, a warm black-brown that seems to absorb what little light there is. Her mane is black and falls in the thick tangle over the right side of her neck, and her tail is the same deep black, and her muzzle and the tips of her ears are black as well, a soft sooty black that makes the rest of her coat seem even warmer by contrast. You have always liked this mare, her steadiness, her calm, the way she stands so still that she seems to be part of the stable itself, a breathing piece of the architecture. You decide that today will begin with her grooming. The gelding had his turn yesterday, the long, slow circles of the currycomb over his grey-dappled coat. But today the mare's coat needs the same attention, and there is something about the muffled quiet of the fog that calls for a slower kind of work, a grooming that is less about the task and more about the presence. You take the currycomb from its hook and the soft brush and the smaller round comb for the lower legs, and you carry them to her stall, setting them on the wooden ledge beside the door while you unlatch the gate. The latch makes its usual clunk, but the sound is swallowed immediately by the thick air, and as you step inside the stall, the mist seems to follow you, curling around the gap in the door like a slow grey cat slipping through a crack. The mare turns her head to watch you enter, and she blinks once, a slow, deliberate closing of her eyelids that is like a kiss given in the dark. You begin with your hands, not the comb. You stand beside her shoulder and place both palms flat against her neck, the warmth of her body rising through the short, dense coat and into your fingers, which are still cold from the morning air. She does not move. She stands with a stillness that is deeper than the gelding stillness, a stillness that seems to come from somewhere inside her bones, as if she has decided that there is nowhere else she would rather be, and nothing else she would rather do than stand here in the fog with your hands on her neck. You feel her pulse through the skin, a slow, steady throb that matches the dripping of the mist outside, and after a moment you begin to move your hands in long, flat strokes down the side of her neck. Not grooming yet, just touching, just letting her know that this is how the morning will pass. The hair of her coat is fine and short and lies flat against the skin, and it is slightly oily to the touch, a natural waterproofing that helps her stay warm in the damp. Your palms grow warm with the friction, and the mare lowers her head a fraction of an inch, her eyes closing halfway so that the dark lashes cast small shadows on her cheeks. When you finally take up the curry comb, you do not begin with circles. Instead, you draw the comb in long, straight lines along the grain of the hair, from the top of her neck down towards her shoulder, and the teeth of the comb leave faint trails in the coat like the tracks of a rake in a smooth gravel path. The sound is different from yesterday, a softer, more muted scratch, because her coat is less dusty, and the comb's teeth encounter only the fine particles of the night's rest. The hair lifts slightly and then settles back, and a faint haze of brown dust rises and hangs in the damp air, too heavy to float far, falling back almost immediately to the straw. The mare sighs, a long, slow release of breath that stirs the hairs of her mane and makes them sway like seaweed in a gentle current, and you feel the sound as much as you hear it, a vibration that passes from her ribcage into your arm. You work your way down her neck to the point of her shoulder, where the bone makes a sharp angle under the skin and the coat changes direction in a small whirl of hair that grows in a spiral. You pause at this whirl and use the tip of your finger to trace its pattern, a clockwise spiral no larger than a thumbnail, and the mare twitches the skin there once and then is still again. The comb resumes its straight strokes, moving now across the broad flat of her shoulder blade, a surface that rises and falls with each breath she takes. The light in the stall is dim and colourless, the lamp flame the only source of any warmth in the greyness. And under this light, the mare's coat takes on the quality of dark velvet, a deep, rich brown that has no highlights because there is no direct light to create them. She stands so calmly that you could almost believe she is asleep on her feet, a talent that horses have and that never ceases to bring a quiet kind of wonder to your mind. She turns her head then, a slow movement that you feel before you see it, because her weight shifts and the straw crunches under her near hind foot. She brings her nose to your shoulder, the soft black muzzle pressing against the wool of your tunic, and she inhales deeply, taking in your scent as if confirming that you are who she thinks you are. Her breath is warm and damp and smells of hay and the faint sweetness of saliva, and you stand still and let her investigate you. Your hands pausing in their work, the currycomb hanging loosely from your fingers. She stays like that for a long moment, a muzzle buried in the cloth of your shoulder, and then she withdraws with the same slow, deliberate motion and returns her head to its previous position, her ears relaxing, her lower lip drooping just a little. The gesture feels like a gift, a small exchange of trust that requires no words and no acknowledgement, and you resume the grooming with a slightly lighter touch, as if the comb were passing over something more precious than horsehair. You move around to her other side, stepping carefully over the straw, and you begin the same straight strokes along the right side of her neck. The lamp is on this side of the stall, and the flame casts a warm orange glow across her coat that makes the brown seem redder, the colour of autumn bracken or the embers of a dying fire. The mare's mane hangs down this side in a thick black curtain, and you stop your grooming to lift a handful of the mane and let it run through your fingers. The hairs are coarse and strong, each one as thick as a bristle from a brush, and they separate under your touch into individual strands that have a slight wave, a memory of the way they grew from the crest of her neck. You work your fingers through the mane from the roots to the tips, gently loosening the small tangles that have formed overnight where the hairs rubbed against each other as she slept. The roots are warm, the skin beneath them soft and slightly greasy, and the mare leans her head away from the pressure just enough to tell you that it feels good, that the pulling of the tangles is a pleasant sensation rather than an irritation. You find a small burr caught in the lower part of the mane, a relic of some past outing to a field, and you work it free with your thumbnail and let it fall to the straw, where it will be swept away with the morning's cleanings. The grooming of her body continues with the same slow rhythm, the comb travelling down her back and along her ribs and over the curve of her belly, and the mare remains utterly still except for the steady in and out of her breathing. Her flanks are sensitive, as most horses' flanks are, and when you reach that area, you lighten the pressure of the comb until it is barely touching the hair, just enough to lift the dust without tickling. She does not flinch or twitch. She simply watches you with one dark eye, her head turned just enough to keep you in her vision, and her trust is a quiet thing that fills the stall like the mist fills the yard outside. You finish the right side and return to the left to sweep the body brush over every surface, the long horsehair bristles picking up the last of the loosened dust and leaving the coat with a uniform gleam that is subtle and deep, a shine that comes not from the surface but from within the hair itself, the health of the animal made visible. The mare's black points, her ears and muzzle and the lower parts of her legs need a different kind of care. You take up the small round curry comb, the one with the fine teeth, and you sit on the low wooden block in the corner of the stall to bring yourself level with her lower leg. She lifts her foot for you without being asked, the way the gelding did, but there is a difference in the way she does it, a slower, more deliberate offering, as if she has thought about it and decided that yes, she will cooperate. The hoof is dark and dense, the horn smooth and cool, and you wet the fine comb around the coronet where the hair meets the hoof. The short black hairs there as soft as velvet. The mare's ears are next, and you stand again and reach up to gently rub the base of each ear with your thumb, the hair there short and fine and warm. She closes her eyes fully when you do this, her whole face relaxing into an expression of deep contentment, and a tiny shiver runs through her from ears to tail, a shudder of pleasure that is as clear a communication as any word could be. The grooming is done. You gather the brushes and combs and carry them out of the stall, latching the door behind you with a soft clunk that the mist swallows whole. The mare remains standing in the center of her stall, her coat gleaming darkly in the lamplight, her mane smooth and hanging in a neat black fall, her ears soft and drooping. She looks like a horse that has been painted in oils, all deep browns and blacks, and the faintest highlights of copper where the lamp flame finds the curve of her shoulder. You hang the tools on their hooks and walk to the main door, pushing it open just a crack to look out at the yard. The mist is still there, as thick as ever, a wall of whiteness that hides the kitchen garden and the infirmary and the cathedral itself. The cobblestones are invisible beyond a distance of perhaps 10 paces, and the only sign that there is a world out there at all is the sound of the mist dripping from the eaves, a steady pattering that is louder now than it was when you woke. The drops fall from the thatch in a random sequence, hitting the stones with small dark splashes, and the moss in the crevices is bright green and swollen with moisture. The air tastes of wet wool and river water and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves, and it is so cold and damp that your breath plumes out in a white cloud that merges with the mist and disappears. You stand in the doorway for a while, listening to the dripping, feeling the fog settle on your face and hands in a fine layer of tiny droplets, and then you close the door and return to the warm darkness of the stable, where the lamp still burns and the mare still stands in her quiet perfection, and the day continues its slow suspended drift through the muffled hours of the Tuesday morning. The fog begins to thin sometime in the middle of the morning, not by lifting as it did yesterday, but by fading, the whiteness growing gradually more transparent until the shapes of the yard outside begin to reappear like objects emerging from deep water. First, the corner of the kitchen garden wall resolves into a faint grey line against a paler grey background. Then the cobblestones nearest the door become visible one by one, their rounded tops glistening with the moisture that has settled on every surface. The thatch overhead drips more slowly now, the intervals between drops lengthening from a steady patter to a sporadic plink, and through the gap in the door, you can see that the sky is still a uniform grey-white, but a higher grey-white than before, the ceiling of the mist having retreated upward until it is no longer mist, but simply a low overcast. You have spent the time since grooming the bay mare in small quiet tasks that needed no special attention, checking the hay nets and smoothing the straw in the cob's stall and trimming the wick of the oil lamp. But now the thinning fog calls you to the threshold, to the boundary between the warm animal interior and the damp stone world outside. You take up the large broom that leans against the wall beside the door, the one with the hazel twigs bound around an ash handle with strips of soaked willow bark. This broom is different from the birch broom you use for the aisle inside the stable. It is longer in the handle, broader at the head, and the twigs are thicker and coarser, meant for the rougher work of stone and earth rather than the smooth flagstones of the interior. The hazel twigs have darkened with age and use, their bark worn away in patches to reveal the pale wood beneath, and the tips are frayed into a stiff brush that is still serviceable despite its rough appearance. The handle is smooth under your palm, polished by the grip of many hands over many seasons, and at the very top someone long ago carved a small cross with the point of a knife, a simple thing that has been worn almost flat by the friction of fingers but is still visible if you know where to look. You push the stable door open wider than its usual gap, swinging both leaves outward on their iron hinges until they rest against the stone walls of the doorway. The outside air flows in freely now, cool and damp and smelling of wet stone and wet earth, and the faint clean scent of the river, somewhere beyond the priory walls. It is not a cold that bites, but a damp chill that settles on the skin like a second garment, and you are glad of the thick wool of your tunic as you step out onto the threshold stone. The threshold is a single long block of grey limestone, wider than a man's foot is long, set into the ground at the entrance to the stable so that its top surface is level with the flagstones inside, but raised slightly above the cobbles of the yard. It is worn down in the centre where countless feet have passed over it, a shallow depression that holds a small pool of water this morning from the dripping thatch. Around this pool the stone is stained a darker grey, and scattered across its surface are the remnants of yesterday and the night, dried mud that flaked from your own shoes and from the hooves of horses, a few broken strands of straw that have escaped from the stalls, the brown curled fragments of the oak leaves that blew in when the door was open, and a fine gritty dust that has no single source but is simply the accumulation of time and traffic. You begin to sweep. The hazel twigs make a different sound from the birch broom, a harsher, scratchier sound, more like the noise of a stiff brush on rough wood than the soft whisper you are used to inside the stable. The sound is sharp enough to carry a little way into the yard, and one of the crows that had been examining the cobbles near the kitchen wall looks up with a jerk of its black head before returning to its search. You work the broom in long, even strokes, starting from the left side of the threshold and moving towards the center, the twigs catching the loose debris and pushing it ahead of them in a small rolling wave. The dried mud breaks apart and crumbles into reddish-brown dust that mingles with the grey grit, and the straw stalks tumble over each other like tiny logs caught in a current, and the oak leaves crackle and curl tighter as they are pushed along. The water in the shallow depression slows the broom slightly, the twigs dragging through it with a wet hiss, and you adjust your stroke to sweep around the edge of the pool, gathering the debris from the drier parts first and leaving the wet center for last. The motion of sweeping the threshold is different from sweeping the aisle, because the surface is not level and the debris is not uniform. Each stroke requires a slight adjustment of the angle, a tilt of the wrist, a shift in pressure, and your body learns these adjustments without your mind having to direct them. Your arms move in the steady rhythm that all sweeping work demands, a rhythm that comes from the shoulders and travels down through the elbows to the hands, and your feet shift slowly along the threshold as you work your way from one side to the other. The fresh air on your face is pleasant after the close warmth of the stable, and you breathe it in deeply, the moisture in it coating your throat with a coolness that is almost a taste. The mist continues to thin, and now you can see the full outline of the kitchen garden wall and the bare apple tree beyond it, and the dark shape of the infirmary roof with its grey slates glistening as if they have been varnished. When the threshold stone is swept clean, you pause and lean on the broom handle, looking at the pile of debris you have gathered at the edge of the stone where it meets the cobbles. The pile is a small mound of mixed materials, the colours blending into a general brown-grey, that is the color of all things that have been walked on and weathered. You sweep this pile off the edge of the stone onto the cobbles, and then you sweep it a little further, guiding it towards the shallow drainage channel that runs along the base of the stable wall. The channel is a narrow trench lined with flat stones, meant to carry rainwater away from the building, and the debris settles into its bottom, where the next rain will push it further along and eventually into the soakaway near the garden. You make a mental note to clear the channel properly before the winter rains begin in earnest, but that is a task for another day, a day when the mud is thicker and the water is flowing. With the threshold clean and the broom returned to its leaning place against the wall, you turn your attention to the stone trough. The trough stands against the outer wall of the stable, just to the left of the doorway. A long rectangular basin carved from a single block of grey sandstone that must have been brought here from a quarry many miles away. It is as long as a man is tall and as wide as a man's shoulders, and its outer sides are rough with the marks of the mason's chisel, while the inner basin has been worn smooth by the constant friction of water and the occasional rasp of a horse's tongue. The trough is fed by a small lead pipe that protrudes from the wall. It's end-shaped into a simple spout that drips even now with the condensation of the fog, though the main flow of water comes only when the tap inside the stable is turned. Beneath the spout, the sandstone is stained a dark greenish black, where the constant moisture has encouraged a growth of tiny mosses and lichens, and at the other end of the trough, a broad notch cut into the rim allows excess water to spill out into the same drainage channel that carries the yard's runoff. You approach the trough and look down into its basin. The water that remains from the last filling is shallow and still, no deeper than the length of your thumb, and its surface is not clear, but clouded with a fine green haze, the beginning of the algae that always grows in standing water, no matter how clean the stone beneath. The algae forms a thin film that clings to the sides of the trough below the waterline, a slippery coating of deep green that is almost black in the dim light, and where the water has evaporated at the edges, it has left a faint tide mark of dried greenish brown, like the ring inside a forgotten cup. The horses do not mind the algae, or if they do, they have never shown it, but you know that the trough should be clean, that the water should be fresh, and the stone should be scrubbed back to its natural pale grey. And you know that this is a task that wants doing on a day when the fog has kept everyone inside and no one is waiting for you to finish. You go back into the stable to fetch the scraping slate and the stiff brush you use for the trough. The slate is a flat piece of grey roofing stone, roughly the size of your spread hand, with one edge chipped to a blunt blade that can scrape away the algae without scratching the softer sandstone beneath. You found this slate years ago in a pile of broken roofing material behind the infirmary, and you have kept it ever since because it fits your hand perfectly and does exactly what it needs to do. The brush is a block of wood with short, stiff bristles of pig hair, the kind that can scrub stone without wearing away, and its handle is wrapped with a strip of leather to make the grip easier on wet hands. You carry these tools outside and set them on the rim of the trough, and then you roll up the sleeves of your tunic to just above the elbow, the cold air raising a pattern of tiny bumps on the skin of your forearms. You reach down into the basin and pull out the wooden plug that sits in the drainage hole at the trough's lowest point. The plug is a tapered cylinder of oak, swollen with moisture so that it fits tightly in its seat, and you have to work it back and forth with a gentle rocking motion before it comes free with a soft sucking sound. The remaining water drains away through the hole, running out onto the cobbles and into the channel with a gurgle that rises in pitch as the flow narrows to a trickle and then stops. The bottom of the trough is now exposed, a smooth expanse of pale grey sandstone covered with a slick layer of green algae that glistens wetly in the flat light. The smell that rises from the drained trough is faintly vegetal, like the smell of wet leaves at the bottom of a pond, not unpleasant, but organic and cool. You kneel on the cobbles beside the trough, the stones hard under your knees through the wool of your leggings, and you take up the slate scraper in your right hand. The first stroke of the slate against the sandstone produces a sound that is unlike any other sound in the stable yard, a thin, high rasp that skates along the edge of hearing and leaves a faint shiver in the air. The algae comes away in a soft green paste that curls up ahead of the slate's edge like wood shavings under a plane, and beneath it the sandstone is revealed as a clean, pale grey, almost white in the damp light. You work the scraper along the bottom of the trough first, long parallel strokes that overlap at the edges so that no green is left behind, and the paste of algae accumulates on the blade and has to be wiped off against the rim of the trough every few strokes. The wiped paste falls onto the cobbles in small dark green dollops that will be swept away later or washed away by the next rain, and you continue scraping, the rhythm of the work taking hold of your arm, the rasp and pause and wipe becoming a cycle as steady as the curry comb's circles. The sides of the trough are more difficult, because the curve of the basin makes it hard to get a flat stroke with the scraper. You work carefully here, using the chipped edge of the slate to follow the contour of the stone. Your wrist bent at an angle that begins to ache after a while, but not enough to make you stop. The algae on the sides is thicker than on the bottom, having had more time to grow undisturbed, and it comes away in longer strips that drape over the scraper like wet fabric. The sandstone beneath is stained a faint green even after the algae is removed, the color having seeped into the pores of the stone over many seasons. But this stain will fade with time and fresh water and sunlight, and it does not trouble you. What matters is that the slick, slippery layer is gone, replaced by the clean, matte surface of stone that has been cared for. When the scraping is finished, you set the slate aside and take up the stiff brush. You dip the brush into one of the water pails you filled earlier, the cold water shocking your hand for a moment before you grow accustomed to it, and you begin to scrub the trough's interior with short, vigorous strokes. The brush hisses against the stone, a sound softer and wetter than the rasp of the scraper, and the water darkens the sandstone to a deep grey that is almost blue. The scrubbing removes the last traces of algae paste, and brings a faint lather to the surface, the natural soapiness of the pig bristles mixing with the water and the remaining organic matter. You rinse the brush frequently in the pail, the water growing cloudier with each rinse, and you work your way from one end of the trough to the other, along the bottom and up the sides and around the curved corners, until every inch of the interior has been scrubbed. Your hands are red with cold now, the knuckles stiff, but the work has a satisfaction to it that makes the discomfort seem distant and unimportant. You take the pail and pour its dirty water into the drainage channel, watching it run along the stones and disappear around the corner of the stable. Then you go inside to the water bucket you filled from the well yesterday, the bucket that holds the reserve supply for the horses, and you dip the pail again and fill it with clean water. This water is still cool and clear, having sat in the dim stable away from the sun and the dust, and when you pour it into the trough it splashes against the clean sandstone and runs down the sides in sheets that leave the stone gleaming. You pour carefully, the water rising in the basin with a soft gurgle, and you watch the surface smooth out into a perfect plane of liquid that reflects the grey-white sky and the bare branches of the apple tree and the dark shape of your own head bent over it. When the trough is nearly full, you push the wooden plug back into its hole, tapping it home with the heel of your hand until it sits flush and tight. The surface of the water shivers with each tap and then gradually returns to stillness, and the reflection of the sky settles into it like a painting laid flat on a table. You stand up slowly, your knees protesting with a dull ache, and you stretch your back by pressing your hands against your hips and arching backwards. The mist has thinned to a faint haze now, and you can see the full length of the yard and the cloister arch at its far end, and the grey bulk of the cathedral's eastern towers rising beyond. A few figures are moving about now, dark shapes in woolen robes, their footsteps muted by the damp air. You gather the scraper and the brush and the empty pail, and you carry them back to their places inside the stable, where the warmth wraps around you like a blanket after the chill of the outside work. The trough stands clean and full against the wall, waiting for the horses, waiting for the next drinker, waiting for nothing in particular, and the threshold stone is swept and dry, except for the faint damp patch in its worn center. The morning has become afternoon without your noticing, the hours having slipped away into the rasp of slate and the scratch of hazel twigs, and the stable is quiet and orderly, and the day continues its slow turning towards evening, and there is nothing more that needs doing at this moment. And so you stand in the doorway with your hands resting on your belt, and you watch the last of the fog dissolve into the grey air, feeling the calm that comes from clean stone and fresh water, and the simple completion of small necessary things. The afternoon has drawn itself out like a long thread of wool pulled slowly from a fleece, and now the light begins to change its quality in the way that tells you evening is approaching, even though the sun remains invisible behind the grey overcast. The stable interior shifts from pale grey to deep grey, the shadows in the corners thickening and the spaces between the rafters filling with a soft darkness that seems to rise from the floor rather than descend from above. The horses know this hour as well as you do, and they begin to stir with a new kind of awareness, an anticipation that shows itself in small ways. The chestnut cob rises from his straw bed at last and shakes himself with a great rattling of his hide. The grey gelding turns his head towards the hayloft and pricks his ears forward, and the bay mare, who has been standing so still for so long, shifts her weight from one hind foot to the other and back again in a slow rocking night. The pack ponies in their shared stall push their heads together more closely still, as if conferring on the evening's arrangements. You feel the change too, not as urgency, but as a gentle inclination towards the tasks that must be done. Before the dark settles fully over the priory, the tasks of warmth and feed, and the small comforts that turn the stable from a daytime workplace into a nighttime refuge. The first of these tasks is the horse blanket. The blankets are kept folded over the broad wooden rail that runs along the back wall of the stable, a rail of beechwood supported by iron brackets driven into the stone, and on it rest 4 blankets of heavy brown wool, each one as large as a man's cloak and nearly as heavy. The wool is a rough homespun, woven in the priory's own weaving shed, from the fleeces of sheep that graze the marshes down by the river, and it has the colour of dark earth mixed with roots, a brown that is not one brown, but many browns blended together into a shade that has no name. The blankets are edged with a simple blanket stitch of coarser thread to keep them from unravelling, and their surfaces are slightly felted from years of use, the individual fibres having tangled together into a dense mat that will hold warmth even when the air is damp. They smell of lanolin and hay and the faintest trace of horse, and when you lift one from the rail it settles into your arms with a weight that is almost like holding another person, a sleepy child perhaps, or a bundle of dry firewood. You carry the blanket across the aisle to the bay mare's stall, the wool draping over your outstretched arms and brushing against your thighs as you walk. The mare watches you come with her head turned and one ear cocked back, and she blows a soft breath through her nostrils as if to acknowledge the purpose of your visit. She has worn this blanket many times before, on many cold nights, and she knows what the wool means: warmth, protection from the draughts that creep through the stone walls when the temperature drops, the particular comfort of having her back covered while she dozes. You unlatch the stall door with one elbow, the other arm occupied with the blanket, and you step inside and stand beside her shoulder, just as you did this morning when you carried her coat to a deep shine. The blanket must be placed carefully so that it lies evenly across her back, without wrinkles that might rub or bunching that might slip to one side in the night, and you take a moment to fold it to the right width before you lift it. You raise the blanket with both hands, holding it high enough to clear her withers, and you lay it across her back with a gentle sweeping motion, the wool settling over her spine like a slow wave breaking on a smooth beach. The mare stands perfectly still, her head lowered just a little, and the blanket covers her from the base of her neck to the top of her tail, the front edge falling just behind her shoulder blades, and the back edge draping over her hindquarters in a soft brown curtain. The wool immediately begins to mould itself to the shape of her body, the weight of it pressing the fibres into the contours of her back and ribs, and you run your hands over the surface to smooth out any small folds, feeling the warmth of her coat already beginning to rise into the fabric. The blanket changes her appearance entirely, turning her from a sleek dark horse into a soft shape that is more like a piece of furniture, a warm breathing presence that seems to have settled more deeply into the straw just by being covered. You check the fit around her chest, where a broad strap of leather can be fastened to keep the blanket in place if the wind is strong, but tonight the air is still and the stable walls will keep out the worst of any breeze, so you leave the strap hanging loose. The mare turns her head and noses at the blanket on her shoulder, her black muzzle lifting the edge for a moment before she lets it fall back into place, as if to confirm that yes, this is the familiar wool. Yes, this is the evening ritual. Yes, all is as it should be. You give her neck a final stroke, the short hairs warm under your palm, and then you step out of the stall and latch the door behind you. One blanket done, but the others must wait. The gelding will need his soon, and the cob, but the hay comes first, because the horse's hunger is growing with the fading light, and you can hear the first faint sounds of impatience beginning. a soft stamp of a hoof, a low whicker from one of the ponies. The hayloft is reached by the ladder of peeled ash poles that stands against the wall at the far end of the aisle, its top leaning through a square opening in the ceiling where the boards have been cut away to make a hatch. The ladder is sturdy despite its rough construction, the poles as thick as your wrist and lashed together with strips of rawhide that have hardened over time into a grip as firm as iron, and the rungs are worn to a smooth polish in the centers where countless boots have pressed. You climb the ladder slowly, one rung at a time, feeling the slight give of the ash under your weight, and the air grows warmer and drier as you ascend, the accumulated warmth of the horses rising to collect under the thatch. Your head emerges through the hatch into the loft, and the smell that greets you is the smell of summer stored away for winter, a deep, sweet fragrance of dried meadow grass and clover, and the faint herbal notes of the wildflowers that were cut and dried, along with the hay. The loft is a long, triangular space under the peak of the roof, the rafters sloping down on either side to meet the floorboards, and the floor is covered with a thick layer of loose hay that crackles under your feet as you step off the ladder. The hay is a pale greenish gold, the color of dried sunshine, and it is shot through with the darker greens of dried plover leaves and the brown of dried vetch stems, a tapestry of all the plants that grew in the water meadows through the long warm months. At the far end of the loft, a small unglazed window, no more than a slit in the gable wall, lets in the last of the grey daylight and a thin stream of fresh air that keeps the hay from growing musty, and dust motes dance in the beam of this light like a slow snow falling upwards. You kneel in the hay and take up one of the hemp nets that lie folded near the edge of the hatch, a net with a wide mouth and a knotted mesh that will hold the hay while letting the horses pull it out strand by strand. The net is rough in your hands, the hemp fibers stiff and scratchy, and it smells of the hay that has been packed into it many times before. You begin to fill the net, gathering armfuls of hay from the loose pile and pushing them into the open mouth. The hay rustles and whispers as you gather it, the dry stalks sliding over each other with a sound like sheets of paper being shuffled, and the dust that rises from the pile is fine and golden and catches in your throat with a tickle that you suppress by breathing through your nose. Each armful you compress into the net by pressing down with your forearm, the hay springing back at first and then settling into a dense mass that will last the horse through the night. The fragrance intensifies as you work, the crushing of the stems releasing the oils that have been locked inside since the cutting, and you are surrounded by a cloud of scent that is the essence of June captured in the dark of November. You fill the net until it is round and heavy, a ball of hay as large as a sack of grain, and then you pull the drawstring tight and tie it off with a knot that your fingers make without instruction. The net hangs from your hand with a satisfying weight, and you lower it through the hatch and let it drop to the flagstones below, where it lands with a soft thud that sends up a puff of dust from the aisle. You fill a second net for the gelding, then a third for the cob, and a fourth and fifth for the ponies, each net taking the same armfuls of hay, each one tied with the same knot, the work a repetition that requires no thought but keeps your body moving in the warm dry air of the loft. When the last net is tied and dropped, you climb back down the ladder, the rungs familiar under your feet, and the stable air feels cooler and heavier after the loft's dry warmth. The nets lie in a row on the flagstones like large sleeping creatures, and you pick up the first one and carry it to the bay mare's stall, hanging it from the iron ring set into the wall at the height of her head. The ring is old and dark, forged by a smith long before you were born, and it creaks faintly as the weight of the net settles onto it. The mare moves to the net immediately, her nose pushing into the mesh, and she pulls out a strand of hay with a gentle tug that rocks the net on its ring. She chews with a slow, steady rhythm, her jaw moving in a sideways grind, and the sound of her chewing is a sound of deep contentment, a sound that fills the stall and spills out into the aisle. You hang the second net in the grey gelding's stall, and he too begins to eat with the same slow rhythm, his eyes half closing in pleasure. The chestnut cob is standing now, his white star bright even in the dimness, and he greets his net with a soft nicker before settling into his meal. The two ponies share a larger net that you hang between their stalls, and they eat together with their heads close, their breath mingling, the occasional soft squeak of a displaced pony, the only sound of disagreement. The hay nets are all hung now, and the stable fills with the gentle chorus of chewing, a sound that is like rain on a roof or the rustle of wind in dried leaves, a sound that has no edge and no urgency, a sound that has no edge and no urgency, a sound that means safety and sustenance and the quiet passing of the evening hours. You return to the blanket rail and take down a second blanket for the grey gelding. He is older than the mare by several years, and the cold settles into his joints more readily. So you choose a thicker blanket for him, one with an extra layer of wool batting sewn between the outer layers in a pattern of diagonal stitches. The blanket is heavier than the mare's, and when you lay it across his back he lets out a long sigh that seems to come from somewhere deep in his chest, a sigh that says "thank you" in a language that needs no words. You smooth the blanket over his flanks and check the fit around his neck, and he leans into your touch for a moment before returning his attention to the hay net. The chestnut cob receives the third blanket, a slightly smaller one that fits his compact frame, and the ponies, who share warmth between them, need no blankets tonight, for they are thick-coated and hardy and prefer to press their bodies together in the dark. The last of the grey light is fading from the window now, the slit in the gable wall turning from pale grey to charcoal, to a darkness that is indistinguishable from the stone around it. You walk the length of the aisle with the oil lamp in your hand, trimming the wick and checking the oil level, and the flame casts a small warm circle of light that moves along with you, illuminating the horses one by one as you pass. The blankets are all in place. The hay nets are all hung. The chewing continues in its steady chorus, and the stable has become a kind of cocoon, a warm pocket of life tucked into the cold stone body of the priory. You set the lamp on its shelf at the end of the aisle, and you stand for a while in the centre of the floor, listening to the horses eat, listening to the silence that lies beneath the eating. And you feel the weight of the day settling into your bones. A good weight, the weight of work done and horses cared for, and the long dark hours ahead when nothing more will be asked of you until the morning comes again. Wednesday arrives, not as a day, but as a sound that has been going on for so long by the time you wake that it has become part of the silence itself. The rain is a steady, gentle, perpendicular rain that falls straight down from a windless sky, and it drums on the roof tiles with a soft, continuous hush that is less like a noise and more like a texture laid over the world. You lie under your blanket and listen to it, the way it fills the thatch above you and seeps into the straw and the wool and the wood, until everything in the stable is slightly dampened, slightly muted, wrapped in the acoustic softness that only rain can bring. The horses are already awake, standing in their stalls with their blankets still on from the night, and they are not restless, because the rain does not make them restless. It makes them sleepy and patient, the way it makes all creatures sleepy and patient, the way it makes all creatures sleepy and patient when there is nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. The grey gelding has his hind hoof cocked and his eyes half closed, and the bay mare stands with her head low and her ears flopped sideways, and the cob is lying down again in the fresh straw, his legs tucked under him like a cat's, and the ponies are sharing their breath in the dim corner of their stall. You rise slowly because the rain makes you slow, and you move through the stable lighting the second lamp to join the first, the two small flames pushing back the darkness that seems thicker than usual this morning. The window in the gable wall shows nothing but a rectangle of charcoal grey, streaked with the silver threads of raindrops running down the outside of the glassless opening. And when you push the stable door open just a crack to look out, the yard is a sheet of dark, wet cobbles reflecting a sky that is the colour of pewter. The rain falls into the puddles that are formed in the low places and sends up small circles that expand and cross one another and disappear, and the moss in the crevices is bright emerald green and swollen with water, and the drainage channel runs with a thin stream that gurgles around the corner. You close the door again, and the sound of the rain becomes once more a sound heard through walls, softer but still present, a constant presence that will not leave for many hours. The task that presents itself this morning, while the rain falls and the horses doze and the outside world is reduced to a grey curtain of water, is the hoof pick. The hooves of the grey gelding need attention, particularly his hind hooves, which have a way of packing with straw and mud in the wet weather. And you know that standing in damp bedding is not good for the horn or the frog, the soft V-shaped part in the centre of the sole that acts like a cushion for the leg. You take down the hoof pick from its peg on the tool wall, a simple instrument of iron with a curved hook at one end and a flat scraper at the other. The whole thing no longer than your hand from wrist to fingertip. The iron is dark with age and polished bright at the tip of the hook where the friction of hoof horn has worn away the patina, and the grip is wrapped with a thin strip of leather that has molded itself to the shape of the fingers that have held it before you. You also take the stiff brush, the one with the short pig bristles, and a dry rag, and you carry these to the gelding stool, the tools fitting easily in one hand. The gelding is standing with his weight on 3 legs, the near hind hoof resting on its toe with the underside tilted up in the classic pose of a horse at rest. He does not move when you enter the stall, except to turn his head and look at you with one dark eye, and then he returns his gaze to the front and lets his ears droop lazily to the sides. The candle you brought with you sits in a niche in the stone wall, a hollow in the masonry that was made for just this purpose, and its flame is steady and tall because there is no draught in the stall, the rain having sealed all the gaps with its damp weight. The candlelight casts a warm yellow glow on the straw and on the gelding's grey coat, and on your hands as you set the tools down on the wooden ledge beside the niche. You begin with a word, the low murmuring sound that tells the horse you are there and that you are going to ask something of him, and then you run your hand down the back of his hind leg from the stifle to the hock to the cannon bone. The leg is warm and the hair is coarse and short, and you can feel the tendons running like taut cords under the skin. When your hand reaches the fetlock, the tuft of longer hair that grows at the back of the pastern, you press gently just above the hoof and give a soft command, a click of your tongue that means lift up. The gelding shifts his weight slightly and raises his hoof, bending the leg at the hock, and you catch the hoof in your left hand and cradle it against your thigh, the rough horn cool and slightly damp against your palm. The hoof is a dark grey, almost black around the rim, fading to a paler grey towards the sole where the horn is thinner and more worn. The underside is packed with a mixture of straw chaff and dried mud, and a small amount of the manure that is an unavoidable part of a horse's night. The debris has been compressed by his weight into a dense cake that fills the hollow of the sole and covers the frog, and in the crease between the frog and the bar, the ridge of horn that runs alongside it, there is a darker line of moist material that has begun to soften the horn. You take the hoof pick in your right hand and set the curved hook against the edge of the packed debris, working it in gently so as not to jab the sensitive sole, and you begin to prise the cake away from the horn. The material comes away in pieces, some of them crumbling into dust, others holding together in solid clods that fall to the straw with a soft thud. The smell that rises from the hoof is earthy and warm, the smell of the stall floor concentrated into a small space, and it mingles with the smell of the candle and the rain and the wool of the gelding's blanket. You work the hook carefully around the frog, which is a softer, more rubbery substance than the horn around it, shaped like a blunt arrowhead pointing towards the toe, and you scrape away the debris that has lodged in the cleft of the frog without digging too deep. The gelding stands perfectly still, his leg relaxed in your grip, and his head is low and his eyes are half closed in the candlelight, a picture of patience that has no equal in the human world. When the bulk of the debris is removed, you switch to the scraper end of the pick and use it to clean the sole more thoroughly, the flat edge sliding over the horn and lifting the finer particles that the hook left behind. The sole is slightly concave, a shallow dome that arches away from the ground, and the scraper follows this curve with a series of short strokes that produce a soft rasping sound, a sound that is quickly absorbed by the rain on the roof. You pay particular attention to the groove that runs around the edge of the sole, the white line where the wall of the hoof meets the sole, because this is where stones can lodge and cause bruises, but the gelding's hoof is clean and sound. The white line a pale even band with no dark spots or cracks. The frog needs its own attention, and you use the scraper to gently pare away the loose, ragged bits of frog tissue that have begun to peel. This is a delicate task because the frog is sensitive, and you do not want to cut too deep, but the gelding's frog is healthy, and the dead material comes away easily, revealing the firmer, fresher frog beneath, a substance that is slightly moist and has the texture of hard rubber. You brush the entire underside of the hoof with the stiff pig bristle brush, the bristles getting into the crevices and sweeping away the last of the dust, and then you wipe the hoof wall with the dry rag, the horn taking on a faint sheen in the candlelight. The hoof is clean now, the sole smooth and the frog defined and the wall a neat dark curve, and you lower the gelding's leg gently back to the straw and give his flank a pat that means good horse. All done. The near forehoof is next, and you move to the front of the horse and run your hand down his shoulder and along the back of his foreleg, feeling the different shape of the tendons here, the way they run straighter and shorter from knee to fetlock. The gelding lifts his foreleg when you ask, bending it at the knee so that the hoof comes up towards his chest, and you hold it against your knee while you work. The forehooves are rounder than the hind, more symmetrical, and the debris packed into them is usually less because the horse carries more of his weight on his front feet and the straw does not compact in the same way. But still you clean the sole methodically with the hook and the scraper, working around the frog and the bars and the white line until the hoof is as clean as the first. The candle flame flickers once, just once, when a drop of rain finds its way down through the thatch and lands somewhere near the niche. But the flame recovers and burns steady again, and you continue the work without pause. You move around the gelding and do the off-hind hoof, then the off-fore, and each hoof takes its own time. Each one reveals its own small story of the night. The off-hind having a tiny stone lodged in the white line that you work loose with the point of the hook, and examine briefly before dropping it to the straw, a small grey pebble that must have come in on your own shoe, or been picked up in the yard. The gelding accepts all of this with the same deep patience. His only response, a slight shift of his weight when you move from one side to the other, and a long, slow exhale when the final hoof is set down and he is standing square on all 4 feet again, his hooves clean and his legs sound. The rain continues to fall. It falls on the roof tiles and runs down into the thatch and drips from the eaves, and it has been falling for so many hours now that you can no longer imagine a world without it. A world of dry cobbles and pale sky, and the sound of crows walking on stone. The stable has contracted even further into itself, the warmth of the horses and the blankets and the 2 small flames creating a pocket of dry air that resists the damp pressing in from outside, and the smell of the hoof parings mingles with the hay and the wool and the leather until it is simply the smell of a rainy Wednesday, a smell you have known many times before and will know many times again. You gather the tools and wipe the hoof pit clean with the rag before hanging it back on its peg, and you take the candle from the niche and carry it down the aisle to check on the other horses. But they are all standing or lying in their own clean stalls, their own clean hooves having been picked yesterday and not yet in need of another session. You pause beside the bay mare to listen to the rain, to feel the particular stillness of the stable on a wet day when no one comes to the door and no one calls from the yard and the whole world seems to have paused to let the water fall. The mare has her blanket on and her hay net half eaten, and she turns her head to look at you with an expression of mild curiosity, as if to ask whether the rain will ever stop, and you touch her nose with the back of your fingers and give her the answer that is no answer, the low murmur that means we will wait and see. The flame of the candle burns straight up without a tremor, and the rain drums on, and the morning passes into afternoon without any change in the light, a seamless transition marked only by the gradual consumption of hay and the gradual accumulation of hours, and you sit on the bench near the tool wall and let your hands rest and your mind drift, and the sound of the rain becomes a blanket just as warm as the wool on the horses' backs. The rain has not stopped. It has settled into a rhythm so steady and so patient that it seems less like weather and more like a condition of the world, a permanent state of wetness and soft drumming that erases the line between morning and afternoon and evening. You have spent the hours since the hoof picking in a quiet drift of small tasks, none of them pressing, and all of them done in the half-light of the 2 oil lamps and the single candle that you move with you from stall to stall like a small portable sun. The horses have grown accustomed to the rain as you have, and they stand in their stalls with their blankets still on and their hay nets slowly emptying, their jaws moving in the endless sideways rhythm of creatures that know how to wait. The grey gelding has finished his first net and is now working on a second that you hung for him an hour ago, and the bay mare has eaten exactly half of hers, saving the rest for the deeper part of the night when she will wake and need something to occupy her. The chestnut cob has lain down again in his straw, and the ponies have turned themselves around in their stall, so that they now face the back wall, their tails towards the aisle, a small rearrangement that seems to satisfy some need known only to ponies. Now the evening feed is due. The hay is for bulk and warmth, the long fibres that will sit in the gut and slowly ferment and keep the horses warm through the cold wet hours. But the grain is for something else, for energy and condition, and the small bright pleasure of a different taste. The grain is kept in the feed bin, a large chest that stands in the far corner of the stable, against the wall where the shadows are deepest, even at midday, and today are nearly black. You walk to it with the candle in one hand, the flame drawing a shifting golden circle on the flagstones and on the stone walls and on the dark mass of the bin itself, as you approach, and you set the candle on the small shelf that juts from the wall beside the bin, a shelf that holds a wooden scoop and a small measure and a clay pot of the mineral powder that you add to the feed once a week, but not today. The feed bin is a chest of dark oak, its planks as wide as a man's spread hand and as thick as a thumb, joined at the corners with dovetail joints that have held fast for generations. The wood is nearly black with age, darkened by the oils of the grain and the hands that have touched it, and the simple passage of many years in a dim corner, and its surface is smooth, except where the grain has risen in a subtle pattern of vertical lines that follow the growth of the tree. The lid is a single heavy slab of oak with iron hinges along the back edge, and it is closed now, fitting tightly onto the chest so that no mice or moisture can find their way inside, and the iron latch at the front is shaped like a simple hook that catches in an eye and holds the lid down with a firm grip. The bin rests on 4 short legs carved into the shape of squat animal feet, perhaps lions or perhaps dogs, the carving worn so smooth that the original intention of the craftsman has been lost, and only the vague shape of a paw remains. You lift the latch with your thumb, the iron cold and slightly rough with the bloom of rust that forms whenever the air is damp for too long, and the hook slides free of its eye with a small clink that is immediately swallowed by the sound of the rain. You take hold of the lid with both hands, gripping the front edge where a notch has been cut, to give your fingers purchase, and you lift. The hinges protest with a low groan, the sound of iron moving against iron after sitting still for half a day, and the lid rises heavily, revealing the contents of the chest in the flickering candlelight. The scent that rises from the open bin is so rich and so immediate that it seems to fill the entire corner of the stable in an instant, a warm, sweet, nutty fragrance that speaks of harvested fields and threshing floors and the long golden afternoons of August. It is the scent of oats, pale and clean and faintly grassy, layered over the deeper, earthier scent of crushed barley. And beneath both there is a subtle, dusty note that is simply the smell of dry grain sitting in a wooden chest, a smell that makes you think of bread and porridge and the kitchens of the priory on a winter morning. Inside the bin, the grain slopes away from the front edge in a shallow hill of mixed oats and barley. The oats are pale cream color and the barley a darker, golden brown, the two grains mingling together like pebbles on a beach, where 2 different kinds of sand have been washed together by the tide. The surface of the grain is dimpled and textured, the individual oats and barley kernels lying at all angles to one another, and here and there a small piece of chaff has drifted to the top, a papery fragment of husk that was not winnowed away and now rests on the grain like a tiny pale moth. You take up the wooden scoop from the shelf, a simple utensil carved from a single block of beechwood, its bowl worn thin at the front edge where it has been pushed into the grain thousands of times, and you dip it into the bin, the bowl sliding into the grain with a soft rushing sound that is like a hand pushed into dry sand. The grain resists slightly, and then parts, flowing into the scoop and over its sides in a small landslide of pale and golden kernels, and you lift the scoop out full and level it with a single stroke of your forefinger, the excess grain falling back into the bin with a patter that is too soft to hear beneath the rain. The feed bags hang from iron hooks on the wall beside the bin, a row of coarse linen bags with drawstrings at their mouths, each one labelled with a small leather tag that bears the initial of the horse it belongs to. You take down the first bag, the one marked with a G for the grey gelding, and you open its mouth wide with one hand while the other hand tips the scoop so that the grain pours in. The sound of the grain falling into the bag is a soft hissing that rises and falls as the kernels slide over one another, and the bag grows heavier in your hand as it fills, the linen bulging and the drawstring pulling tight against your wrist. You measure out 3 scoops for the gelding, each one levelled with the same careful finger, and then you pull the drawstring closed and hang the bag on its hook to wait. The bay mare's bag receives 3 scoops as well, the grain falling in the same soft hiss, and the chestnut cob gets 2 scoops, for he is smaller and gains weight easily, and the last thing he needs is to grow round on too much grain. The ponies share a single bag between them, 2 scoops that will be divided into their separate feed buckets later, and when all the bags are filled and hung, you lower the lid of the bin with the same heavy groan of the hinges and slide the latch back into place. The horses have heard the grain. They have been listening to the sound of the scoop in the bin and the hiss of the oats falling into the bags, and the stable has come alive with a new quality of attention. The gelding has his head over the stall door and his ears pricked sharply forward, and he is blowing soft, quick breaths through his nostrils that flutter the straw on the door ledge. The mare is watching you with her calm, dark eyes, but her ears are forward too, and the cob has risen from his straw bed and is standing with his head turned towards the aisle. Even the ponies have emerged from their shared corner and are pressing their noses against the partition. You take down the gelding's bag first and walk to his stall, and he steps back to let you enter, his hooves lifting and placing with a careful precision that speaks of his eagerness. You pour the grain into his feed bucket, a deep wooden bucket fixed to the wall at chest height, and the grain rattles against the wood in a brief stony clatter before settling into a neat mound. The gelding plunges his nose into the buckets before you have even finished pouring, his long grey face buried to the eyes, and the sound of his eating is a grinding crunch that is entirely different from the soft, steady chewing of hay. A sound of teeth crushing hard kernels, a sound of deep and immediate satisfaction. You feed the mare next, then the cob, and lastly the ponies, dividing their shared grain into 2 piles in their separate buckets, and for a while the stable is filled with the music of crunching and grinding, the percussion of grain being reduced to meal. The rain continues its steady hush above, and the lamps burn steadily, and you stand in the aisle with the empty feed bags in your hand and watch the horses eat, the way their ears flicker with each particularly good mouthful, the way they push the grain around the bucket with their muzzles to catch every last kernel, the way they lift their heads briefly to chew and then plunge them down again for more. The grain will be gone in a few minutes, replaced by the slower pleasure of the hay nets, and the horses know this and savour the grain while it lasts, their eyes half closing with the pleasure of it. While they eat you turn and look up towards the rafters, drawn by a small sound that is not the rain and not the chewing, a sound so tiny that at first you think it is part of the rain, a variation in the drumming, but then you hear it again and you know it for what it is. It is the sound of sparrows. You raise the candle higher and look at the beam that runs across the stable just under the thatch, the beam where the rafters meet the top of the wall, and there, tucked into the angle between the wood and the reed, are 3 small shapes that you had not noticed before. They are sparrows, common brown-grey sparrows of the kind that live in every eave and cranny of the priory, and they have crept under the thatch to escape the rain, finding a gap where the reed has pulled away from the beam, and a narrow ledge of wood gives them just enough room to perch. They have been there for some time, perhaps since the rain began this morning, and they are fluffed up against the damp, their feathers puffed out so that each bird looks almost twice its normal size. A round ball of grey-brown with a small dark eye and a beak no longer than a grain of barley. You stand very still, the empty feed bags hanging from your hand, and you watch the sparrows. They have settled into the immobility of small birds at rest, their heads pulled in close to their bodies and their feathers overlapping like the tiles on a roof, each one a soft mosaic of greys and browns, and the faintest touch of chestnut on the wings. One of them shifts slightly, lifting a tiny foot and tucking it up into the warmth of its belly feathers, and then it is still again. Another opens its beak in a silent, gaping motion that is not a cheep, but the ghost of one, as if it is dreaming of calling out and has not quite managed it. The third sparrow is the boldest, or perhaps simply the most awake, and it turns its head to look at you with one bright black eye that glints in the candlelight, a perfect bead of jet set in a ring of pale feathers, and it considers you for a moment before tucking its head under its wing with a quick decisive motion and becoming a featureless ball of fluff. The sound they make is the faintest of cheeps, a series of tiny high notes that are not quite a song, and not quite a call, more like the soft muttering of very small voices talking to themselves as they settle down for the night. The cheeps rise and fall and sometimes overlap, a whispered conversation that is too quiet to wake anything, too soft to disturb the horses, too gentle to register as noise at all unless you are standing very still and listening very carefully. You lower the candle, careful not to startle them, and you move away from the corner to leave them in peace. The sparrows are a part of the stable as much as the horses and the hay and the smell of grain. A small piece of the living world that has found a dry place in the wet afternoon and will spend the night there, their tiny hearts beating slowly, their feathers keeping out the chill. They will be gone in the morning when the rain stops, out into the yard to search for crumbs and seeds, but for now they are a quiet presence overhead, a reminder that the stable shelters more than just the tall, long-legged creatures in the stalls below. You fold the empty feed bags and hang them on their hooks, and you check the bin lid one more time to make sure it is secure, the latch firm and the hinges quiet. The grain is stored again, the sparrows are resting, the horses have finished their feed and have returned to their hay nets, and the sound of crunching has given way once more to the steady, grinding chew of hay, the sound that is the background of all stable life. The rain is the only other sound, the constant pattering hush that wraps around everything, and you stand in the center of the aisle with the 2 oil lamps burning on either side of you, and you let the peace of the moment settle over you like a blanket, like the wool blankets on the horses, like the darkness that is gathering outside where the yard is a sheet of water, and the cathedral towers are lost in the grey, and the world has shrunk to this one room with its beasts, and its birds, and its quiet, unending rhythm of beats, and its birds, and what bite. Thursday evening comes with a change in the air, a change so subtle that at first you feel it only as a slight lifting of the weight that has pressed on the stable for 2 days. The rain has stopped. It did not stop suddenly with a final drop in a clearing sky, but rather it tapered away over the course of an hour, the drumming on the roof tiles growing softer and more intermittent until it became a scattered patter. And then the patter became individual drops falling from the thatch with long pauses between them. And then even those pauses lengthened until there was only silence and the water dripping from the eaves into the puddles below. The silence that follows the rain is a different kind of silence from the silence that comes before it, deeper and cleaner, and full of a freshness that washes the air of its staleness. You can smell it even inside the stable, the new cold air that seeps through the gap in the door, carrying the scent of washed stone and wet earth, and the distant clean smell of the river running fuller than it did yesterday. The horses have felt the change as well. The grey gelding has shifted his weight onto all 4 feet, and is standing more alertly, his ears moving forward and back as he listens to the quiet that has replaced the rain. The bay mare has lifted her head from her hay net and is looking towards the door with her nostrils flared, taking in the new air with long, slow breaths. The chestnut cob has risen from his straw and shaken himself, the blanket you put on him earlier slipping slightly to one side before he settles it back into place with a shrug of his shoulders. The ponies have turned themselves around again so that they face the aisle, their small dark eyes watching the door with the patient expectation of animals who know that the weather has shifted and that something, however small, will be different now. Even the sparrows in the rafters have stirred, one of them pulling its head from under its wing and cheeping once, a single bright note that hangs in the still air before fading. This is the last round of the evening, the final check before the dark settles in earnest, and the stable gives itself over to the long hours of the night. You take up the oil lamp from its shelf, the one with the fresher wick and the fuller reservoir, and you begin your slow walk down the length of the aisle, pausing at each stall to look in on its occupant and make sure that all is well. The lamp flame is steady and tall now that you have turned up the wick a little, and it casts a warm circle of light that moves with you as you go, illuminating the straw on the floor and the dark shapes of the horses and the pale gleam of the hay nets hanging from their iron rings. The gelding has enough hay to last him until morning, the net still half full and swinging gently from the motion of his pulling, and his water bucket is still a third full, enough for the night. You pause at his stall, and he turns his head to look at you, his dark eyes reflecting the flame in 2 tiny points of light, and you reach over the door to scratch the flat plane of his cheek just where the grey hair is softest. He leans into your touch for a moment, and then returns to his hay, and you move on. The mare is next, standing with her blanket still straight on her back and her hay net nearly finished, and you make a note to hang a fresh one before you settle for the night. Her water is low but not empty, and you will top it up on the final pass. The cob is lying down again, but his eyes are open and he blinks at you slowly as the lamplight passes over him, the white star on his forehead glowing pale against the dark chestnut of his coat, and you see that his blanket has slipped. And so you enter the stall briefly to straighten it, pulling the wool back into place over his compact round body while he sighs and stretches one foreleg out in front of him like a cat stretching a paw. The ponies are standing together as always, their shared blanket bunched between them where they press against each other, and they blink at the light with identical expressions of mild curiosity, their small ears swiveling towards you and then away. At the end of the aisle, the lamp shelf waits, a simple plank of oak set into a niche in the stone wall, and on it sit the 2 oil lamps that have burned through the long wet days and nights of this week. The oil in the reservoirs is low, the level visible through the translucent horn that forms the body of each lamp, a dark amber line that sits just above the base. The wicks are both charred at the tips, the blackened ends curling slightly where they have been burning for hours without trimming, and the flames they produce are slightly wavery, the edges trembling with the impurities that accumulate in any wick that has been burning too long. You set the lamp you are carrying beside the other 2, and you take down the small brass snuffer and the pair of trimming scissors that hang from a hook on the edge of the shelf, tools so small and delicate that they seem out of place in a stable full of large animals and rough wood. But they are necessary, and they have been kept here for as long as anyone can remember. The first lamp is the one that has been burning on the shelf since this morning, the one you lit when the darkness was still thick and the rain was still falling. You lift the glass chimney carefully, the horn panels of the lamp body warm but not hot, and you set the chimney aside on the stone shelf where it will not roll. The flame burns bare now, a small bright tongue of yellow that waves gently in the movement of air you have created, and the smell of the burning oil is stronger without the chimney to contain it, a faintly smoky scent that is not unpleasant, but simply the smell of light. You take the trimming scissors and reach carefully towards the flame, the small sharp blades closing around the charred tip of the wick, and you snip it off with a single quick motion. The blackened wick end falls into the lamp reservoir, where it will float on the oil until the lamp is cleaned, and the flame immediately burns brighter and steadier, the fresh wick drawing the oil up more efficiently now that the clogged tip is gone. You use the point of the scissors to adjust the height of the wick, pushing it up just a fraction until the flame is the size of a thumbnail, a perfect teardrop of light that burns without any smoke or wavering, and then you replace the chimney with careful hands, the glass sliding into its seat with a soft click. The second lamp receives the same treatment, its wick trimmed and its flame adjusted, and then the third, the one you carried on your walk down the aisle. And when all 3 are burning steadily, you set the scissors back on their hook, and take up the oil flask that sits at the back on their hook, and take up the oil flask that sits at the back of the shelf. The flask is a simple clay bottle with a narrow neck and a cork stopper, and the oil inside is a pale amber that glows in the lamplight when you hold it up. You top up the reservoir of each lamp with a slow, careful pour, the oil trickling down the inside of the horn with a gentle gurgle, and the level rises from low to half full to nearly full, the dark line climbing against the pale horn. The smell of the fresh oil mingles with the smell of the burning wicks, a clean, faintly fatty scent that speaks of olives pressed somewhere far away in a warm, dry country, very different from this wet November stable. With the lamps trimmed and filled, you turn your attention to the final small tasks of the night. You take the fresh hay net you prepared earlier and carry it to the bay mare's stall, hanging it beside the nearly empty one, so that she will have plenty of hay for the long hours ahead. She watches you with her calm, dark eyes, and then returns to her chewing, the new net swinging slightly from the motion of your hanging. You top up the water buckets from the pail you brought in from the trough earlier, the fresh water splashing softly into the wooden buckets and settling into stillness, and you check the blankets one last time, running your hands over the wool to make sure no folds have formed that might rub in the night. The gelding's blanket is still smooth and straight, the mare's is still in place, the cobe's is still covering his round body where he lies in the straw, and the ponies have their shared warmth and need nothing more. The sparrows in the rafters have settled again after their brief stirring, and when you lift the lamp to look at them, you see 3 small balls of fluff tucked so close together that it is hard to tell where one bird ends and the next begins. Their cheeping has stopped entirely now, replaced by the utter stillness of small creatures in deep sleep, and their feathers are still puffed out against the cold, making them look like little feathered apples perched on the beam. You lower the lamp and leave them to their rest, the image of their soft bodies staying in your mind as you walk back to the center of the aisle. The straw pallet in the corner near the door is waiting for you. It has been waiting all day, the rough woolen blanket folded at its foot and the straw inside the ticking slightly flattened from the nights before, forming a shallow hollow that has begun to take on the shape of your body. You set the lamp on the flagstones beside the pallet, the flame illuminating the straw and the blanket and the rough stone wall behind your sleeping place, and you untie the hemp cord from your waist and hang your tunic on its peg for the night. The cold air touches your arms and shoulders briefly, raising a pattern of small bumps on the skin, but you will be under the blanket soon, and the cold will not last. You take the woolen hood from its peg, the one that has not yet been needed this autumn, but might be tonight with the temperature dropping after the rain, and you lay it at the head of the pallet, where you can reach it if the cold deepens in the hours before dawn. You lie down on the pallet, the straw rustling under your weight with a dry papery sound that is as familiar as your own breathing, and you pull the heavy woolen blanket up over your body, tucking the edge under your chin and around your shoulders. The wool is rough at first against your skin, but the warmth begins to build almost immediately, your own body heat reflecting back from the dense fibers and creating a small pocket of comfort that will grow through the night. The lamp on the flagstones continues to burn, its flames steady and small, and you leave it burning because you always leave one lamp burning, a small point of light in the darkness that is not for you, but for the horses, so that they can see the shapes of their stalls and the familiar outlines of their hay nets and know that all is well. From where you lie, you can see the rafters overhead, the dark oak beams running across the ceiling like the ribs of a ship, their surfaces touched with the faintest glow from the lamp on the floor. The thatch between the beams is a dark tangle of reed and straw, and somewhere up there the sparrows are sleeping, and beyond the thatch the sky is clearing, the clouds breaking apart to reveal the cold stars of a late November night. You cannot see the stars from inside the stable, but you know they are there, and you think about them for a moment without any particular focus, the image of clear cold light spreading across the darkness above the priory. The shadows in the corners of the stable are deep and soft, and the shapes of the horses are dark masses in their stalls, and the only movement is the gentle rise and fall of their breathing, the slow, steady rhythm that has been the constant background of all your days. The distant sound of the night office bells drifts across the priory, faint and musical, and softened by the stone walls and the thatch and the wool of your blanket. The monks are rising from matins, their voices beginning the chants that will carry them through the dark hours until dawn, and the sound of the bells is like a thread of silver woven into the dark fabric of the night. You listen to the bells without listening, the sound washing over you without requiring any response, and you feel the warmth inside the blanket growing deeper and more complete, spreading from your chest down through your legs and up into your neck and face. The straw in the pallet has accepted the shape of your body now, the small hollows cradling your shoulders and hips and the curve of your spine, and the wool of the blanket has begun to smell faintly of your own skin, mingled with the ever-present hay. The horses are quiet. The grey gelding has finished his hay, and is standing with his head low and his eyes closed, the blanket on his back a dark shape against the darker stall, and the bay mare is dozing too, her weight on 3 legs and her breathing deep and slow. The chestnut cob has stretched out full length in his straw, his legs extended and his nose resting on the bedding, and the ponies have leaned into each other so completely that they look like a single 2-headed creature of dark brown wool. The sparrows are invisible in the rafters, tiny sparks of life hidden in the thatch, and the 3 lamps burn steadily on their shelf and on the flagstones, their flames straight and tall and perfectly still in the draughtless air. You let your eyes close slowly, the weight of your eyelids greater than the effort of keeping them open, and the darkness behind your closed eyes is warm and soft and full of the quiet sounds of the stable. The smell of hay and horses and lamp oil and clean wool is the last thing you are aware of before the awareness itself begins to fade, and the sound of the horses breathing, the slow in and out of 6 sets of lungs moving in a rhythm that has no beginning and no end, is the last sound you hear as you slip gently into sleep, the deep, unbroken sleep of a quiet night in a quiet stable, where the work is done and the animals are safe and the cold, clear stars wheel slowly overhead, making a sound.